Hook. The moment Officer Derek Solano yanked the military badge off Captain Nora Vess's uniform and threw it onto the asphalt like trash. Nobody standing on that highway shoulder expected what came next. They expected her to cry. They expected her to beg. They expected her to do exactly what every other person Derek Solano had humiliated over 11 years in uniform had done. Fold. Instead, Nora looked at the badge lying in the gravel, looked back at the man who put it there, and said 7 words that would eventually end his career, collapse his department's command structure, and land him in federal court. She said, "You just made the worst mistake of your life." Nobody believed her. They would. Before you go any further, if this story already has your attention, hit subscribe and stay with me until the end. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The highway between Caldwell Junction and Fort Mercer ran through a stretch of high desert that most people only ever saw through a windshield, moving fast, not stopping, scrub brush, flat rock, the kind of sky that went on forever in every direction and made you feel small no matter who you were. It was the kind of road where nothing happened, or the kind where, when something did, there was nobody around to see it clearly. Captain Nora Vess had driven this road dozens of times over the past 4 years. She knew the mile markers, knew where the asphalt cracked near the old overpass, knew that the turnout at mile 62 caught a crosswind that would rattle a vehicle if you weren't holding the wheel steady. She wasn't thinking about any of that when she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. She was thinking about the debrief she owed her commanding officer by Aero 800 the next morning, the 3-day classified medical assignment she'd just completed at a forward operations support site 40 miles east, and the fact that she hadn't slept more than 5 hours total in the past 72. She pulled over without hesitation. That was muscle memory. You saw lights, you stopped. You didn't run calculations, didn't argue with yourself. Nora had been conditioned since her first week in uniform to move with clarity under pressure, and a routine traffic stop didn't register as pressure. It registered as a minor inconvenience on the tail end of an already long week. She put the car in park, cut the engine, and reached for her registration and military ID before the officer had even stepped out of his cruiser. Derek Solano was 38 years old with 11 years on the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department. He walked with the particular kind of confidence that came not from competence, but from never having been seriously challenged. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, thick neck, the type who had probably been physically intimidating since high school, and had arranged most of his adult life around making that work for him rather than developing other skills. He had a reputation in the department for closing cases fast, which in practice meant he decided what he believed had happened and then assembled the paperwork to match. Supervisors called him efficient. The 3 deputies who had quietly requested reassignments after working closely with him called him something else, but none of them had filed formal complaints because they'd watched what happened to the last person who tried. He approached Nora's window with one hand resting near his belt and his eyes already moving across the interior of her vehicle in that particular way that was less about safety and more about establishing dominance before the first word was spoken. "License and registration," he said. No greeting, no explanation of why he'd pulled her over. Nora handed both through the window without comment. She also held up her military ID card, which she kept clipped to her document wallet specifically for situations like this, traveling in and out of Fort Mercer, sometimes in civilian clothes, sometimes in uniform, sometimes carrying orders that couldn't be fully explained to a civilian law enforcement officer without a secure line to verify. Today, she was in uniform. Army combat uniform, rank insignia visible, the Fort Mercer Medical Unit patch on her shoulder, and the badge of her unit clipped to the left breast of her jacket. The badge wasn't decorative. It was an official credential, the kind issued to personnel with classified assignment clearance, and it carried identification codes that any federal database would recognize. Solano looked at the license, looked at the military ID, looked at her. "You stationed at Fort Mercer?" "Yes, sir. Captain Nora Vess, Army Nurse Corps. I'm returning from a support assignment." He handed the license back without looking at it again. "Where'd you say you were coming from?" "A forward support site east of the junction. I'm not at liberty to give the specific location without a secure line, but my orders are in the bag on the back seat if you need to verify my travel." Something shifted in his expression. Not curiosity. something closer to annoyance. The look of a man who felt like he was being told a story he hadn't asked for. "You mind stepping out of the vehicle?" Nora paused. It was a brief pause, the kind of person with training makes when they're running a quick internal calculation before responding. Nothing about this stop warranted her stepping out of the car. She hadn't been speeding. She knew her speed, had checked it twice in the last 5 miles out of habit. Her registration was current. She had valid ID. "Can I ask what the reason for the stop was?" she said, keeping her voice level. "Failing to signal a lane change back at the junction." She had signaled. She was almost certain she had signaled, because signaling lane changes was the kind of automatic behavior she'd adopted long ago as a driver who spent too many hours on open highway to let habits slip. But she wasn't going to argue that in the first 30 seconds. She opened the door and stepped out. Solano moved around her slowly, eyes still doing that inventory sweep. He stopped when he got to the badge on her uniform. "What's this?" "That's my unit credential. I'm assigned to the 44th Medical Response Group." "This a real thing?" She looked at him steadily. "Yes, it's a real thing." He reached out, and before she could process what he was doing, his fingers closed around the badge and he pulled. The clasp gave way with a sharp crack, the kind of sound that was small in physical terms and enormous in every other way. The badge came free. He turned it over in his hand like he was examining something he'd found on the ground. Nora's jaw tightened. "That's official military property and a federal credential. You need to return that." "Looks like a prop to me," Solano said. "I've seen people buy these things at surplus stores." "It is not a surplus item. It carries federal identification codes. If you run it through your system, I'll tell you what I'm going to run it through," he said, and his voice had dropped into something almost bored, which was somehow worse than if he'd been angry. "I'm going to run you through, because what I'm seeing right now is someone in a uniform they might not be entitled to wear, carrying credentials I can't verify on the side of a highway, who's been evasive about where she's been." "I haven't been evasive. I told you exactly where I've been. The location is classified, which is a legal designation, not evasion." "That's not a distinction I recognize." 2 cars passed on the highway. Neither slowed. The sun was dropping toward the horizon and throwing long shadows across the asphalt. Nora was acutely aware of how isolated this stretch of road was, and of the fact that her personal phone was in the cup holder inside her car, while her secure communication device was in the duffel on the back seat, which she couldn't reach without Solano's permission. "I'd like to contact my commanding officer," she said. "You'll contact whoever you need to contact after I'm done here." "You're holding a federal military credential that you removed from my uniform without authorization. The longer this goes on, the worse the paperwork gets for both of us. I'm trying to give you a way out of this." He smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. "You know, I've been doing this 11 years, and I don't think I've ever had someone in the middle of a traffic stop try to give me a way out of something." "Then maybe no one's had enough information to know they should." The smile faded. He told her to put her hands on the roof of the car. She complied. Slowly, deliberately, making sure every movement was visible and deliberate, nothing that could be misread. 11 years of watching soldiers operate in high-stress environments had given her a very specific understanding of how situations escalated, and she was running every de-escalation protocol she knew against the reality that this man had already made up his mind about who she was. He searched her vehicle without asking for consent and without explaining what he was looking for. He found her duffel, opened it, went through her equipment bag. He pulled out the secure communication device, a black ruggedized unit about the size of a thick paperback, and turned it over in his hands. "What's this?" "Secure military communication device. That's sensitive equipment, and I need you to handle it carefully." "Why do you have something like this?" "Because my assignments sometimes require it." He set it on the hood of her car. "Not carefully." Nora said nothing. She filed it. She was building a list, and every item on it was going to matter later, and she was experienced enough in the particular bureaucracy of institutional misconduct to know that the details other people overlooked were exactly the ones that held cases together. "I'm going to need you to come with me," Solano said. "On what grounds?" "Suspicion of impersonating a military officer." The words landed with a specific kind of weight. Not because they frightened her, she was past the threshold where he could frighten her with words, but because they told her exactly what kind of problem this was. He wasn't confused. He wasn't working through a genuine uncertainty about her identity. He had decided to make a move, and he was picking the charge that gave him the most room to maneuver. "I am not impersonating anyone," she said. "I am who my identification says I am. You can verify this. I'm asking you to verify this before this situation becomes something neither of us can walk back from. You can explain all that at the station." She looked at the badge still in his hand, looked at her secure comm unit sitting on the hood of her car, looked at the man standing in front of her with 11 years of unchallenged authority and no idea that he was standing in the middle of the worst decision he'd ever make. "All right," she said, "but I want you to know. I'm documenting every second of this." "Sure you are," he said, and reached for his handcuffs. The drive to the Caldwell County substation took 22 minutes. Nora spent most of it running calculations. She was not panicking. Panic was a luxury she'd given up sometime during her second deployment, when she'd learned the hard way that the moment you stopped thinking clearly was the moment patients died. She was working the problem. The problem had several layers. The first was immediate and practical. She was in the back of a sheriff's department vehicle, her hands cuffed behind her, her military ID and credentials seized, her secure equipment sitting in an evidence bag in the trunk. The second layer was institutional. She was going to miss the 0800 debrief, which meant her commanding officer, Major Lena Hargrove, would flag her absence within a few hours. The third layer was the one that was going to take the longest to resolve, but would ultimately matter most. Whatever Officer Solano intended to file against her was going to require a response, and that response was going to require documentation, witnesses, and a very clear paper trail. She had all three. She just needed to get to a phone. The substation was a squat building at the edge of a small commercial strip outside Caldwell Junction proper, a gas station, a farm supply store, a diner that looked like it had been in continuous operation since the 1970s. The parking lot had 4 cruisers and a civilian truck. Solano pulled in without ceremony, walked her through the back entrance, and handed her off to a desk officer who looked at her uniform and then at Solano and said very carefully, "What are we charging?" "Impersonating a military officer, possible possession of stolen federal property." The desk officer, a younger man, maybe late 20s, with a careful, neutral expression, looked at Nora again. She looked back. "I'm Captain Nora Vess, Army Nurse Corps, assigned to Fort Mercer under the 44th Medical Response Group. Officer Solano removed my unit credential from my uniform during a traffic stop without legal justification and seized my official military equipment. I'm requesting the opportunity to contact my commanding officer." The desk officer looked at Solano. "Process her," Solano said, and walked away. They took her fingerprints. They took a photograph. They allowed her one phone call, which she used not to call Major Hargrove directly. She couldn't reach the secure line from a civilian phone, but to call the general administrative number for the 44th Medical Response Group's main office at Fort Mercer, which she knew by heart, and leave a message that said only, "This is Captain Nora Vess. I am being held at Caldwell County Sheriff's Department Substation 3. I need someone to contact Major Hargrove immediately." Then they put her in a holding room that smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee, and they left her there. The holding room had a small window high on one wall, wire-threaded glass that was more opaque than transparent. Through it, she could see a narrow strip of the parking lot, and beyond that, the flat line of the desert horizon going orange as the sun continued to drop. She sat with her back against the wall and her wrists, no longer cuffed, at least, resting in her lap. And she thought about the badge. She had worn that badge for 2 years. It had been issued to her when she was selected for the Classified Medical Response Program, a program so specialized that most personnel at Fort Mercer didn't know it existed. The badge wasn't a symbol, it was a key. It opened clearance levels, authorized her travel, and tied her to an assignment chain that went directly to offices in the Pentagon. Solano had pulled it off like it was a decorative pin. He had held it like it meant nothing, because to him, it meant nothing, because he had already decided what the story was, and the badge didn't fit it. She'd encountered this before. Not often, not in a form this direct, but she had met the version of this man in other institutions. The administrator who questioned her medical decisions because she was young. The senior physician who treated her trauma assessments as approximations until she was proven right by outcomes he couldn't dispute. The specific flavor of contempt that looked at someone who didn't fit the expected shape of authority and concluded, without evidence, that the authority must be fraudulent. She wasn't angry, exactly. Anger was a waste of fuel at this stage. What she felt was more precise than that, a kind of cold, focused clarity about what she was going to need to do, and in what order, and with what evidence. She was still running through the sequence when she heard the sound. It started as something distant and indefinite, a rumble she registered more through the floor than through the walls, a vibration that didn't match the rhythm of highway traffic. Then there were voices outside, the desk officers among them, pitched higher than they'd been. Then someone ran past the holding room door. Nora stood up. She went to the door and knocked. No response. She knocked harder. The small window in the door showed a sliver of the corridor outside, empty. She could hear radio traffic now, broken and urgent, the kind of overlapping dispatch voices that meant multiple units responding to something simultaneously. She knocked again. "Hey, I need someone to tell me what's happening." 30 seconds of nothing, and then the desk officer appeared at the window, his face tight. He looked at her like he was weighing something. "There's been an accident," he said. "Multi-vehicle on Highway 7. A military convoy." Nora felt something shift in her chest. Not fear, not quite. Something more like a switch being thrown. "How many casualties?" "They're still getting reports." "How many?" she said again. "At least 6. "Are there medics on scene?" "I don't know yet." "Then you need to let me out of this room." He stared at her. "I'm a trauma nurse with combat medical training," she said. "I have been doing this for 8 years in the field. If there are injured soldiers on that highway and you keep me in this room, whatever happens to them is going to be documented as part of what happened tonight. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Something moved across his face. Not quite conviction, but its younger sibling. "I can't release you without... I'm not asking you to drop the charges. I'm asking you to put me in a vehicle and take me to that scene. You can cuff me to the door handle if you want. I don't care. But if there are soldiers dying on that highway and I'm sitting in a holding room, I promise you that is the first thing anyone is going to hear about when this is over." He disappeared from the window. Nora pressed her palms flat against the door and breathed. She heard him on the radio. She heard another voice respond. She heard Solano's voice, somewhere further away. And whatever he said, the desk officer's response was short and clipped. The door opened. "I'm driving," the desk officer said. "You're in the back seat. You try anything and I will cuff you to the door. Are we clear?" "Crystal," Nora said, and was already moving. They saw the smoke from a quarter-mile out. It rose in a dark column against the last light of the evening sky. The particular color of burning rubber and hydraulic fluid, acrid and heavy. As they got closer, the picture assembled itself through the windshield in pieces. A military transport truck on its side in the median, a second vehicle crumpled against the guardrail, emergency lights already strobing red and white across the asphalt, and what looked like 5 or 6 figures scattered across the roadway in various states of urgency. 2 civilian paramedics were working the scene, but one was already visibly overwhelmed, trying to manage 2 patients simultaneously, her head snapping back and forth between them. The other was on the radio. A highway patrol officer was directing traffic on the far end. There were soldiers, some of them still in the vehicles, and some of them moving with the careful, deliberate gait of people who were injured but refusing to stop, which Nora recognized immediately as one of the more dangerous presentations, because people in shock often didn't register how seriously they were hurt. The desk officer, whose name badge read Pullman, stopped the cruiser on the shoulder. He had barely put it in park when Nora opened the door and moved. She went to the paramedic first. "I'm Captain Vess, Army Nurse Corps, trauma trained. What do you need?" The paramedic, young, maybe 25, with the look of someone who had not yet seen a mass casualty event and was currently seeing one, stared at her for exactly 1 second. "That one," she said, pointing to a soldier on the ground about 15 feet away who was not moving. "He was responsive 2 minutes ago." Nora moved. The soldier was a young man, probably early 20s, in battle dress uniform with the sleeve torn away at the elbow. He was on his back, breathing, but the breathing was wrong, shallow and labored, with the left side of his chest rising less than the right. She dropped to her knees beside him and put her hands on him immediately, running the assessment she'd done hundreds of times in conditions that made this seem almost quiet. "Stay with me," she said. "What's your name?" No response. She pressed 2 fingers along his neck, finding the pulse, present but weak and fast. She palpated his ribcage and felt it before she heard it, the slight crackling under her fingers that told her what she was dealing with. She turned her head and raised her voice without breaking contact. "I need a chest seal or the equivalent, anything adhesive and occlusive, now." Pullman, standing 6 feet away and clearly at the edge of his operational knowledge, went back to the cruiser. The paramedic was already at her bag. She came back with a sealed package, and Nora had it open in under 4 seconds. The soldier's eyes opened while she was working. He looked at her without fully focusing. "You're going to be fine," she said, which was the thing she said because it was what people needed to hear, and because the job didn't give you the option of uncertainty in those first moments. "Can you tell me your name?" "Corporal. Darius. Darius Holt." "Corporal Holt, I've got you. You're not going to move until I say so. Can you do that for me?" "Yeah." His voice was thin but present. "Yeah, okay." She worked. She was aware of the noise around her. Radio traffic, engines, someone somewhere in significant pain. But it went to the background in the way that everything went to the background when there was a patient in front of her. The seal went on. She monitored his breathing, watched the left side of his chest begin to move more freely, felt the tension go out of his body marginally as the pressure equalized. Across the scene, the second paramedic had gotten another soldier into a recovery position. The first paramedic was now working the vehicle, trying to reach a fourth casualty still in the truck. Nora had been on scene for approximately 4 minutes. She heard someone behind her say, in a very different register than the emergency noise around them, "Who the hell is that?" She didn't look up from Darius Holt. "Who authorized a civilian to—" "She's not a civilian," Pullman's voice. "She's Army. She's—" A pause. "It's complicated." "It's not complicated at all." A new voice, closer. A voice with the particular cadence of someone who is accustomed to being the most senior person in any given room. "Captain, what do you have?" Nora finished securing the seal and looked up for the first time. The man standing over her was wearing Army combat uniform with the insignia of a full colonel on his collar. He was in his late 50s, lean, with the look of someone who had spent decades in field conditions. His name tape read Carver. She looked at him for exactly 1 second, completing the assessment she'd started, and said, "Corporal Holt, probable left tension pneumothorax, now decompressed and sealed. He needs a level 2 facility within 40 minutes to be safe. The soldier by the guardrail has a compound fracture and possible internal bleeding. He's ambulatory, but he shouldn't be. There's a casualty in the vehicle I haven't reached yet, and I need to get to them in the next 60 seconds. Colonel Carver stared at her, not with confusion, with something that was recognition working itself towards certainty. "Your name," he said. "Captain Nora Vest, sir. 44th Medical Response Group, Fort Mercer." He had his radio at his ear before she finished the sentence. Nora was already moving toward the vehicle. She heard him behind her, his voice sharp and very clear, saying into the radio, "Get me Major Hargrove, right now, and get me someone at the Pentagon's medical command desk. I don't care what time it is." She pulled herself up to the door of the overturned transport and looked through the shattered glass at the soldier inside. The soldier looked back at her with the eyes of someone who had given up hoping that help was going to come. "Hi," Nora said. "I'm Captain Vess. I'm going to get you out of there." Behind her, 3 more vehicles had appeared on the highway. Black, unmarked, moving fast against the flow of the emergency vehicles, pulling onto the shoulder with the kind of authority that didn't need lights to announce itself. And in the substation parking lot 4 miles away, Officer Derek Solano had just filed his incident report, closed his laptop with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd already won, and was reaching for his phone to call it a night. Unaware that the body camera footage he'd forgotten to check was still running, had been running the entire time, and had captured every second of what he'd done on that highway, including the part where he'd smiled. The soldier's name was Private First Class Yara Osei, and she was 22 years old and had been trapped in the overturned transport for 11 minutes, which was long enough for the fear to have burned through its first hot layer and settled into something quieter and more dangerous. The kind of stillness that sometimes preceded shock. Nora assessed the situation in the first 3 seconds. Yara was wedged between the collapsed door panel and the driver's seat, which had torqued sideways on impact. Her left arm was pinned but appeared intact, no bone displacement visible, no arterial bleeding. What concerned Nora more was the angle of Yara's neck. The way she was holding herself with the rigid, effortful stillness of someone managing pain they couldn't fully identify yet. Possible cervical strain, possible something worse. Can you feel your feet? Nora asked. Yeah, Yara's voice was hoarse. Both of them. Good. Keep talking to me. Can you move your fingers on the left hand? A pause, a grimace. Some of them. That's okay. That's okay for right now. I'm going to need you to trust me while I work on this door. Is Holt? Holt is going to be fine. He's being looked after. You focus on me. Getting the door open required two things Nora didn't have: equipment and a second pair of hands. She got both within 90 seconds. One of the ambulatory soldiers, a staff sergeant named Briggs, who had a gash above his right ear that he was ignoring with the determination of someone who had decided it wasn't allowed to be his problem right now, appeared at her shoulder with a Halligan bar he'd pulled from somewhere, and together they worked the panel while Nora called the movements, watching Yara's face for any indication that they were making something worse. The door gave. Not cleanly. It bent and shrieked and half-folded before it released, and Nora had her hands on Yara before the metal stopped moving. She ran the stabilization sequence, head, neck, shoulder, and talked through every step because silence was the enemy in these moments. People went quiet right before they went somewhere you couldn't reach them. I've got you, she said. I've got you. On my count, we're going to move you to the left. 3, 2. They got Yara out and onto the flat asphalt of the median with the care of people who understood that the next few minutes would determine the next few years of this young woman's life. Nora kept her spine aligned, kept talking, kept her eyes on the precise intersection of Yara's face and whatever was happening inside her body. Colonel Carver appeared at the edge of her peripheral vision. She was aware of him the way she was aware of weather, as a condition of the environment, not a distraction. Vess, he said. 1 minute, sir. I don't need you to stop. I need you to know that Major Hargrove has been notified and there are 2 additional medical units en route. ETA 18 minutes. Holt can't wait 18 minutes. I know. There's a civilian hospital 11 miles north. We're coordinating now. Good. She glanced up. The soldier by the guardrail, Sergeant Briggs. He's got a scalp lac that's been bleeding longer than he's admitting. He needs pressure and an IV. If the paramedic, already on it. Carver crouched down to her level, which surprised her slightly. Senior officers didn't always do that. I put in a call to Fort Mercer. I spoke to Major Hargrove directly. Nora finished securing the cervical support she'd improvised from equipment in the paramedic's bag and looked at him. What did she say? She said, and I'm quoting, "Whoever called me at this hour better have a very good explanation." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile. Then I explained the situation. And she said she'll be here in 40 minutes and that you should not, under any circumstances, let them take you back to that substation. Nora sat back on her heels. For a brief moment, maybe 2 seconds, something moved through her that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite the absence of tension, but was the particular feeling of knowing that the institutional machinery that was supposed to work was, in fact, beginning to work. It didn't make everything okay. It didn't undo the past 2 hours, but it was a gear catching. Understood, sir, she said. Yara Ose looked up at her from the ground and said very quietly, Are you the one who stabilized Holt? Yes. Thank you, Yara said. It wasn't theatrical. It was just 2 words from someone who understood exactly what they meant. Nora nodded once and moved to the next casualty. Officer Pullman had not gone back to the substation. He was still on the scene, standing near his cruiser with his arms crossed and his radio in his hand, watching the activity on the highway with an expression that was doing a lot of complex work. He'd made 2 calls in the past 20 minutes, one to the substation and one to his union rep, which he'd thought better of and hung up before anyone answered. He was not by nature an introspective man, but standing on the shoulder of Highway 7 watching a woman he'd driven here in a prisoner transport execute trauma care with the precision of someone who had done it in conditions far worse than this, something in his thinking had shifted in a way he couldn't entirely articulate. He was aware, in the blunt and practical way of someone doing a legal risk calculation rather than a moral one, that the situation had changed significantly since Solano filed that report. He was aware that Colonel Carver had been on the phone for almost the entire duration of Nora's work on the scene. He was aware that the three unmarked vehicles on the shoulder weren't civilian, and he was aware that whatever Solano believed he'd managed tonight, the management was becoming less and less stable by the minute. He pulled out his phone and called the substation again. Solano picked up on the second ring. "Tell me she's back in holding." "She's not," Pullman said. "There was an accident. I brought her to the scene." Silence on the other end. Then, "You did what?" "Multi-vehicle on 7 military convoy. She said she was trauma-trained and there weren't enough medics. I made a call." "You made a—" Solano's voice dropped in a way that was worse than if he'd shouted. "Pullman, she's a suspect in an active case. You don't move suspects without authorization. You don't make calls like that on your own." "There were people hurt, Derek. There are always people hurt. That's not your problem. Your problem is following procedure." Pullman looked across the scene at Nora, who was now working alongside the paramedic on Sergeant Briggs, her hands moving with the steady, unhurried efficiency of someone who didn't need to perform competence because she simply had it. He watched Colonel Carver speak into his satellite phone with the focus of a man executing something institutional. "I think," Pullman said carefully, "that we might have a problem. The only problem we have is that you just compromised the chain of custody on a suspect. Come back now. Bring her." Pullman looked at the unmarked vehicles. "I don't think I can do that," he said. Another silence, longer this time. "Excuse me?" "There's a full colonel on scene. He's been on the phone with Fort Mercer, and somewhere else that I don't think is local. There are vehicles here that aren't ours and aren't highway patrol. I don't know who they are, and I don't think you do either. I think maybe we should know who they are before we do anything else tonight." He hung up before Solano could respond, which he'd never done in 11 years, and stood for a moment with the phone in his hand, feeling the particular vertigo of a person who has just made a decision they can't unmake. The 2 additional military medical units arrived in 16 minutes, not 18. They came in a pair of Army transport vehicles with medical markings, and they brought with them 3 more personnel who moved with the kind of coordinated, wordless efficiency that spoke to repetition. People who had done this together before, who didn't need to narrate their actions because the team already spoke the same language. Major Lena Hargrove arrived in 38 minutes. She drove herself, which was notable. She arrived in a government vehicle, got out, and stood for 3 seconds scanning the scene with the assessment gaze of someone building a complete tactical picture before saying a word. She was 44, compact, with close-cropped gray at her temples, and the permanent slight squint of someone who had spent years in high-altitude environments where the light was different. She had been Nora's commanding officer for 2.5 years, and in that time she had learned, through careful observation, that the best thing she could do in a crisis was stay out of Nora's way until Nora needed something from her. She found Nora at the back of the second transport vehicle where Yara Ose was being prepared for evacuation. Nora was giving a handoff report to one of the new medics in the clipped, sequenced shorthand of field medicine. No wasted words, every piece of information load-bearing. Hargrove waited until the report was finished. "Captain Vess," she said. Nora turned. Something in her face shifted. Not relief, but something adjacent to it. The particular expression of someone who has been managing alone and has just seen the person who makes managing alone unnecessary. "Major." "Tell me what happened," Nora told her. "Not everything, not yet, but the essential sequence. The traffic stop, Solano's behavior, the badge, the secure equipment, the holding room, the accident, the scene." She told it the way she told everything, with economy and precision, and she didn't editorialize except in one place. "He smiled when he put the cuffs on," she said. "That's not a detail. That's the detail. He enjoyed it." Hargrove looked at her for a moment. "Do we have that on camera?" "His body camera was running. I don't know if he checked it." "He didn't," said Colonel Carver, appearing at Hargrove's shoulder. They knew each other. Nora could tell from the lack of introduction, the way Hargrove turned toward him without surprise. "My aide ran the body camera protocol as soon as we confirmed the situation. The footage is being secured." "By whose authority?" Hargrove asked. "Mine, for now. There's a federal component coming in that will supersede it, but the footage is preserved." Hargrove nodded. She looked back at Nora. "You need to be checked out." "I'm fine." "That wasn't a question, Captain. Sit down and let someone look at you." Nora opened her mouth. "That," Hargrove said, "is an order." Nora sat down on the rear bumper of the transport vehicle and let one of the medics run a basic assessment. She had a bruised wrist from where Solano had forced her arms back during the arrest. She had road grit embedded in the heel of her right hand from where she'd been placed on the ground. She had a tension headache that she'd been managing for the past 3 hours by ignoring it. None of it was serious. All of it was documented. The medic photographed the injuries. Nora noticed this and didn't comment, because documentation was the correct instinct and she wasn't going to discourage correct instincts. Carver spoke with Hargrove for 11 minutes. Nora could see them from where she was sitting, could see Hargrove's posture change twice during the conversation, the second time in a way that meant she'd heard something she hadn't known before. When Hargrove came back, there was something different in her expression. Controlled, but different. "There are things about your assignment this week that I need you to know I'm now aware of," Hargrove said. "Things above my standard clearance level that were communicated to me in the last 20 minutes. Nora looked at her steadily. "Okay. That badge Solano took from you, the federal database it ties to. There are people who've been notified about its removal who are not at the county level or the state level." "I see," Nora said, because she did see, and because she'd suspected this was the shape of it from the moment Carver had reached for his satellite phone. "This is going to move faster than a standard misconduct complaint," Hargrove said. "I need you to be ready for that, and I need you to be ready for the part where it gets complicated before it gets clean." "It's been complicated since mile 62, Nora said. Hargrove almost smiled. It didn't quite get there, but it was close. "You're going to need to make a formal statement tonight, before you sleep. I'm sorry." "Tell me who's taking it." "Someone from the Army's Inspector General office is 40 minutes out. There will also be a federal agent, civilian, but cleared for the specifics of your assignment." Nora absorbed this. The scope of the machinery moving around her was becoming clearer, and it was larger than she'd initially modeled. That had implications she'd need to think about. "What about Solano?" "He doesn't know yet what's coming. He filed his report. We have a copy, intercepted through the county database as of 12 minutes ago. He's listed the charges and closed the incident. He thinks he's done." Nora looked out at the highway. The emergency lights were still going, but the urgency had shifted. Casualty transport completed. The remaining vehicles being documented and marked, the controlled aftermath of crisis settling in. Corporal Holt was in a vehicle headed for the civilian hospital, stable. Yara Ose was in the Army transport, also stable. Sergeant Briggs had finally sat down long enough for someone to close the gash on his head. "He's not done," Nora said. "No," Hargrove agreed. "He's not." Derek Solano drove home at 9:47 p.m. feeling the specific satisfaction of a man who had handled something that needed handling. He'd built the report carefully. Specific language, documented sequence, the kind of paperwork that told a clear story. He'd charged her with impersonation and possession of stolen federal property. He'd noted her evasive behavior and her resistance during the encounter, which was a flexible description that could mean different things to different readers. He'd listed the seized items as evidence. He'd done this before. Not exactly this, not a military officer specifically, but the general shape of it, the process of constructing a record that was technically accurate in its individual facts, but pointed toward a conclusion he'd already chosen. He was good at it. He ate a late dinner, watched 20 minutes of television, and was getting ready for bed when his phone rang. Unknown number. He let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was from his department supervisor, Captain Rhea Strand, and the tone of it made him sit back down on the edge of his bed before he'd finished listening. "Derek, call me back tonight. I don't care what time it is. Something has come up with the incident report you filed this evening, and I need to hear your account directly before this goes any further. Call me." He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he called her. Strand picked up immediately, which was unusual. She was not a pick-up-immediately person by nature. She was methodical, deliberate, the kind of supervisor who processed before responding. The fact that she answered before the second ring told him something he chose not to fully examine. "Talk to me about the arrest," she said. He talked to her about the arrest. He used the same language as the report, because consistency was important. He heard her listening in that careful, too-still way that experienced people listened when they were building a picture they weren't sharing yet. When he finished, she said, "The badge you took off her uniform." "Evidence of impersonation. I documented it." "Derek." A pause. Not a long pause, but waited. "That badge is flagged in a federal database. The flag activated when the badge went out of contact with its registered carrier. There's currently a federal security notification active because of what you did tonight. He felt something cool move through his chest. I didn't know. That's clear. The question is what else you didn't know, and that's going to matter a great deal in the next 48 hours. She stopped. Then, there's a colonel at Fort Mercer who's been on the phone with the Army IG's office. Captain Vess's CO has already submitted a formal complaint through military channels. And there is a federal agent, civilian, DOJ, who has requested your body camera footage. My body camera? He stopped. Yes, she said. Your body camera. He tried to remember whether he'd checked the footage before filing. He tried to remember whether the camera had been running when he removed the badge, when he put her on the ground, when he processed her into the substation. He tried to remember the smile, whether he'd smiled, and found that he couldn't fully reconstruct his own face in that moment, which was a particular kind of problem. Get a lawyer, Strand said, tonight, before you say anything else to anyone, including me. She hung up. Solano sat in his bedroom in the dark for a long time after that, running through the sequence differently now, running it backward from the end, from the part where something had gone wrong, looking for where he'd made the mistake. He kept landing in the same place, not the badge, not the arrest. Before that, the decision, the one he'd made in the first 30 seconds when he saw her uniform and saw her rank and saw the badge she wore and made a calculation, instant and unexamined, that she was someone who could be handled. That was the mistake. Everything else was just the shape of it. The Army Inspector General officer was a woman named Major Delia Foss, and she arrived on scene at 11:14 p.m. with a civilian agent named Ross Calloway, who had the particular bearing of someone from the Department of Justice Field Division. Not dramatic, not performative, just very, very focused. They set up in a highway patrol unit's mobile command vehicle, which was parked on the far end of the cleared shoulder. Hargrove stayed outside. Carver had already gone, but had left behind one of the personnel from the unmarked vehicles, who stood near the command vehicle without speaking, and didn't need to speak because his presence was already communicating everything necessary. Nora sat across from Foss and Calloway at a small fold-out table and gave them the complete account. She started at mile 62. She went through every exchange with precision, not emotionally, not with embellishment, but with the exact sequenced recall of someone trained to give situation reports under conditions where a missed detail could cost a life. She described what Solano said. She described what she said. She described the badge being removed, the equipment being handled roughly, the arrest, the charge, the holding room. She described Pullman's decision to bring her to the scene, which she noted as the one correct decision made by law enforcement that evening. Foss took notes. Calloway did not take notes. He listened with the complete attention of someone recording in a different way. When she finished, Calloway said, "You mentioned he smiled when he put the cuffs on." "Yes." "Can you describe the smile?" She thought about this seriously because it was a serious question. "It wasn't triumphant," she said. "It was satisfied, like someone who'd managed something they'd been looking for. Like he'd been waiting for a person who wasn't going to push back and found one." "And when he took the badge?" "He didn't smile then. He was contemptuous. There's a difference. Contempt is what you feel before you're certain you've won. The smile was after." Calloway looked at her for a moment with an expression that was neutral on the surface and something else entirely underneath. "Captain Vess, how many times have you been through something like this?" She understood what he was asking. In terms of being underestimated by someone in authority? In terms of dealing with a situation where your credentials were dismissed by someone who made a decision before looking at the facts? "A few times," she said, "in different ways." "And how did those situations resolve?" "Some of them resolved themselves," she said. "Some of them required me to wait and document and trust that the people who were supposed to make the correct decision eventually would." "And this one?" She looked at the table for a moment, then at him. "This one has federal flags on a military credential and a body camera nobody checked, so I think this one resolves differently." Calloway made his first and only note of the interview. He wrote something, capped the pen, and said, "Captain, we're going to need you available for the next 72 hours, possibly more. You understand what's being put in motion here." "I understand." "The charges Solano filed against you will be vacated within the hour. You have full authorization to return to Fort Mercer. But I want to be honest with you. The next part of this process is not simple, and it is not fast, and there are people who are going to try to manage the scope of what happened tonight in ways that protect institutional interests over individual accountability. He said it without apology or performance, which she respected. I know, she said. You're going to need to be willing to push back on that. I know how to push back, she said. He nodded once. Something in his expression settled. I had a feeling, he said. At 11:51 p.m., the body camera footage was pulled from the department's server by federal warrant. At 11:53 p.m., the footage was opened. The first thing that appeared on the screen, before the stop, before the badge, before anything else, was the timestamp. Then the audio activated, and Solano's voice filled the room where Calloway and two technical analysts were watching, clear, unhurried, with the tone of a man who had not yet said anything he'd imagined would be heard by anyone other than a person he intended to intimidate. The footage ran for 41 minutes. It captured the stop. It captured the badge removal. It captured the exact moment and exact words and exact expression on Solano's face when he told Nora she was being charged with impersonating a military officer. And underneath those words, for the first time with evidence to support what anyone watching might have suspected, it captured the calculation. The way his eyes moved when she held up the military ID, the fraction of a second where he read her rank, read her bearing, read every piece of information she was presenting, and made the decision anyway. And it captured the smile. Calloway watched the 41 minutes without speaking. When it ended, he sat for a moment in the silence of the mobile command vehicle with the hum of the generators outside and the flicker of the screen. Send that to Fort Mercer's legal office, the Army IG, and my supervisor, he said. Then archive the original with chain of custody documentation. Do not share it with the county department. The analyst nodded. And find out, Calloway said, how many other stops Solano made in the last 24 months involving veterans or active military personnel. The analyst looked at him. That's going to be a significant pull. I know, Calloway said. I think it's going to be a significant list. 22 miles away, Nora Vess was sitting in the passenger seat of Major Hargrove's government vehicle, watching the desert go dark outside the window, and thinking about Yara Osi's face when the door came free, and about Corporal Holt's pulse under her fingers, and about the badge sitting in an evidence bag in a substation that no longer had any legitimate claim to it. She was thinking about Solano's file, and about the things Calloway had said about institutional protection. She was thinking about the particular patience required for this kind of fight, the discipline of it, the way you had to hold everything you knew without letting it make you careless. She was also thinking, despite herself, about the 18 other veterans Pullman had mentioned in passing near the end of the scene clearance, before she'd left. 18 names he'd said quietly, almost to himself, almost as if he hadn't meant to say it out loud, that Solano had stopped in the last 2 years along this same stretch of highway. 18 names Pullman knew because he'd processed some of the paperwork. 18 people who had presumably not had a Colonel Carver appear on the scene to put a satellite call through to Fort Mercer. Hargrove was driving and not talking, which was one of the things Nora valued most about her. 18, Nora said, half to herself. Hargrove glanced over. What? Something Pullman said. Solano had done this before, multiple times. Veterans, mostly. We'll know more when Calloway pulls the records. We'll know what made it into official records, Nora said. That's different from knowing what happened. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. True. Some of those people didn't have my rank, or my assignment background, or a colonel who happened to be on the same highway. No, Hargrove said. Probably not. So whatever happens to Solano, Nora stopped. Captain, it can't just be about what he did to me. Hargrove looked at the road. Her hands on the wheel were steady. I agree with you. I want that documented. My testimony, my formal complaint, I want it on record that I'm not asking for this because of what happened to me specifically. I'm asking for it because of the pattern. That's going to make this more complicated, Hargrove said. You know that. I know that. A mile passed. The desert was completely dark now, the kind of dark that only happened far enough from city lights that the sky could fully assert itself. The stars were extraordinary out here if you thought to look. You did good work tonight, Hargrove said. On the scene. Holt's doctor called. He's stable, and they're saying the decompression you did was what held him together long enough to get there. Nora looked at the windshield. She didn't say anything for a moment. He's 22, she finally said. He told me his name while I was working on him. Darius, like he needed me to know his name. They always do, Hargrove said. Yeah, Nora said. They do. The vehicle was quiet after that, and then Hargrove's phone rang. The secure line, the tone distinct from the others. And she answered it on the hands-free and listened without expression, while a voice on the other end said something that made her knuckles go briefly white on the wheel and then relax again. She ended the call. Nora, she said, which was unusual. She didn't use first names often. What? Calloway's office just finished a preliminary pull on Solano's stop records. A pause. It's not 18. Nora looked at her. It's 43, Hargrove said. 43 documented stops of active or veteran military personnel in 26 months. 21 of them resulted in arrests or detentions that were later dropped without documentation of the reason. And in 9 of those cases, items were seized that were never returned. The car moved through the dark. 9 people, Nora said quietly, had things taken from them and never got them back. Yes. She looked at her wrist, the bruised one, the one the medic had photographed, and then out the window at the dark. Then we're not done, she said. And 22 miles in the other direction, in a substation break room, Officer Pullman was sitting in front of his locker with his phone in his hand, scrolling through his own memory, the way you scroll for something you know is there but can't find in the dark, trying to attach faces to the names he'd seen in those files, the ones he'd processed and signed off on without looking closely, the ones that were starting to feel, in retrospect, like something he should have looked at more carefully. He'd started making a list. He'd written 4 names when his phone lit up with a message from an unknown number, a number he didn't recognize with an area code that wasn't local, and the message was only 3 words long. We found everything. Pullman stared at those 3 words for a long time. The break room was empty except for him and the hum of the vending machine in the corner. The fluorescent light above him had been flickering for 6 weeks, and nobody had replaced the bulb, which meant the room pulsed slightly, a slow and irritating rhythm that he'd learned to ignore but couldn't tonight. He read the message again. We found everything. No signature, no follow-up, just 3 words sitting in the blue light of his phone screen while his list of 4 names sat on the notepad beside him, ink still fresh. He didn't respond to the message. He wasn't sure who he'd be responding to. What he did instead was sit for another 4 minutes, finishing a calculation he'd started in the car on the way back from the scene. A calculation that had several variables, most of which pointed in the same direction. Then he picked up his notepad, put his phone in his pocket, and walked to the substation's evidence lockup, where the overnight clerk was watching something on a tablet with his earbuds in. I need to review the intake log for tonight's arrests, Pullman said. The clerk looked up. Bit late for that. I know what time it is. The clerk pulled the log. Pullman went through it slowly, reading each entry. Nora's items were listed under a case number he recognized, Solano's case number, the one from the incident report filed at 8:43 p.m. The badge was listed as military-style credential, suspected fraudulent. The secure communication device was listed as electronic equipment, origin unknown. He photographed both entries with his phone. Then he went to his supervisor's office, Strand's office, empty at this hour, and slid a handwritten note under the door. It said only, I need to talk to you before anything else moves on the vest case. I have information. Pullman. He didn't know if that would be enough. I didn't know if he was already too late, already too tangled in whatever Solano had built to be useful to anyone. But he knew that the 4 names on his list were real, and that the message on his phone was from someone who had more names than that, and that sitting still in this building while all of it moved around him was the one choice he was certain he shouldn't make. He walked out to the parking lot, sat in his car, and waited for morning. Nora slept 4 hours. It wasn't a decision. Her body simply extracted what it needed and returned her to consciousness at 5:12 a.m. with the specific alertness of someone whose nervous system had been running on operational mode for long enough that the transition back to rest and then back again was nearly seamless. She was in the transient quarters at Fort Mercer, a spare room Hargrove had arranged. Her uniform was on the chair. Her wrist was wrapped. The medic's assessment paperwork was on the desk beside a bottle of water she'd apparently drunk half of and forgotten. She sat up, ran a quick internal inventory, wrist sore, headache manageable, thinking clear, and reached for her phone. 14 messages. 3 from Hargrove. 2 from Major Foss's office. 1 from an extension she didn't recognize but that had a Pentagon area code. 4 from colleagues at the 44th who had apparently heard enough to know that something had happened. 1 from Corporal Holt's unit medic confirming that Holt had come through surgery and was resting. 1 from an Army JAG officer named Captain Brianna Okafor, brief and direct. I've been assigned to your case. Call me when you're up. It doesn't matter how early. And 1, sent at 3:47 a.m. from a number she didn't recognize that said, there are 43 files, 9 without returns. Calloway is moving on all of them. You should know the department is trying to contain this at the county level. Don't let them. She read that last one twice. Then she called Okafor. The JAG officer picked up on the first ring. She sounded fully awake, which either meant she'd slept efficiently or hadn't slept at all. Captain Vess, thank you for calling. What's the situation? The charges against you were formally vacated at 021 scene. Your items are being retrieved from the substation's evidence lockup under federal order. The badge will be returned to you with a documented chain of custody noting the unauthorized removal. A brief pause. The situation with Solano is more complicated. Tell me. His department's legal counsel made contact with the county DA's office at midnight. They're framing this as a misidentification, claiming Solano lacked the information to correctly verify your credentials and acted in good faith on available evidence. His body camera shows him reading my rank insignia before he pulled the badge. We know that, but the legal argument doesn't require him to have made a correct decision. It requires them to show he made a reasonable one given what he believed. They're going to argue he had legitimate grounds to question your identity. Nora was quiet for a moment. And the 43 stops? Okafor's answer came a half-second slower. Calloway's office is handling that under a separate track. That's federal, civil rights statute, pattern of conduct. The department's legal team doesn't know yet how much Calloway has. Who sent me information at 3 a.m. telling me to make sure this doesn't get contained at the county level? Another pause, longer. I don't have visibility on that. But you're not surprised I received it. I'm not going to comment on that, Captain. Nora understood. Some information arrived from directions that couldn't be named, because naming them would close them. She'd operated in classified environments long enough to recognize the shape of something moving through unofficial channels for official purposes. What do you need from me today? She asked. Your formal testimony, on record, before 0900. Calloway will be there. I will be there. Major Foss from the IG's office will be there. And I need you to be prepared for the possibility that Solano's attorney may attempt to argue that your conduct during the stop, your refusal to answer certain questions about your classified assignment, contributed to the confusion. He can try that, Nora said. I know he can try it. I'm telling you because I need you ready for it emotionally, not just factually. There's a difference. She appreciated that. Okafor had identified the precise gap between knowing your argument is sound and being able to deliver it in a room full of people who want to find the flaw in it. I'm ready, Nora said. I'll see you at 0830. The testimony session was held in a conference room in Fort Mercer's Legal Affairs Building, a room that was functionally similar to the mobile command vehicle from the night before, but with better lighting and worse coffee. Nora sat at one end of the table. Okafor sat beside her. Foss and Calloway sat across. A court reporter worked silently in the corner, and a recording device sat in the center of the table like a small, attentive animal. Calloway had aged slightly from the night before. It was subtle. The particular compression around his eyes that came from spending several consecutive hours watching 41 minutes of footage and then reviewing 43 case files and then not sleeping. He had the look of someone who had found something they expected to find and were not pleased to have been right. Captain Vess, he said, before we begin, I want to inform you that as of this morning, we've completed a preliminary review of all 43 stops. We've identified patterns in 3 categories: unlawful search, evidence seizure without return, and false reporting. The false reporting category alone involves 16 incidents. He let that number settle. This is no longer a single incident investigation. I know, she said. I want my testimony to reflect that. I don't want what happened to me treated as the center of this. What happened to me is the one that left a paper trail big enough to pull. The others are being contacted, Calloway said. We've located 26 of the 43. Some of them have been waiting for someone to call for a long time. She absorbed that without comment. It required a certain kind of discipline to hear that and not let the weight of it destabilize you. 26 people who'd been stopped by the same man on the same stretch of highway and had their credentials questioned or their property taken or their records falsified, and had then gone home to lives that continued while the incident sat in a database somewhere, officially resolved, substantively unaddressed. "Let's begin," she said. The testimony took 2 hours and 14 minutes. Nora was precise, thorough, and, in 2 moments, more direct than Okafor had perhaps fully anticipated. The first was when Calloway asked her to characterize Solano's demeanor during the stop. "He wasn't confused," she said. "People who are confused ask clarifying questions. He didn't ask questions because he didn't need the answers. He'd already made a determination, and he was managing the encounter toward a conclusion he'd chosen. The questions he asked weren't information gathering. They were framing. He was building a story in real time, and he needed my responses as raw material." "And the impersonation charge?" "That charge required him to believe, or to claim he believed, that my uniform, rank insignia, military ID, unit credential, official travel orders, and specialized equipment were all simultaneously fraudulent. It's not a reasonable belief. It's a convenient one." The second moment came at the end when Foss asked whether she believed Solano would have treated a male officer of equivalent rank the same way. She considered this seriously, because it deserved serious consideration. "I don't know," she said. "I think the calculation he made involved multiple factors: my rank, my gender, the isolated location, his history of operating in a corridor with limited oversight. I don't want to reduce it to one variable, because reducing it lets the other variables disappear." She paused. "What I know is that he made a decision about who I was before he looked at the evidence." Calloway wrote something down. This time, he didn't cap the pen. At 11:30 a.m., Derek Solano arrived at his attorney's office on the 3rd floor of a building in downtown Caldwell Junction. His attorney was a man named Warren Getz, who had represented the department's officers in misconduct cases for 9 years and had a success rate he was proud of, built primarily on the institutional reluctance of civilian juries to convict law enforcement on the testimony of people with complicated relationships to the system. He had not yet seen the body camera footage. Getz had, and he opened with it. "I need you to understand," Getz said, setting the tablet on the desk between them, "that the footage exists and is in federal custody, and that I cannot make it disappear, and I am not going to advise you to pretend it doesn't mean what it means." Solano looked at the frozen frame on the tablet, his own face. "How bad?" "The removal of the badge is clear. Your statement that it was probably a surplus store item is clear. The impersonation charge filed 18 minutes after you ran her ID and it came back clean. It didn't come back. Derek." Getz's voice was the voice of a man who had stopped being gentle about something important. "Her ID came back clean. It's in your own system log. You ran it at 6:47 p.m. and it returned a valid military record with a Fort Mercer assignment. You filed the impersonation charge at 7:05 p.m. He let the 18 minutes sit there. That gap is the problem. That gap says you knew." Solano looked at the table. "The federal investigation isn't about the stop anymore," Getz continued. "It's about the pattern. 43 stops. They have records. They have names. They've been making calls since 4 a.m. this morning, and people are talking. Those stops were all legitimate. Were the 9 seizures legitimate? The items that were never returned?" Solano said nothing. "I need you to tell me," Getz said, "about those 9 cases, specifically. Because if there is an explanation for why 9 people's property was logged as evidence and then does not appear in any return documentation or disposal record, I need to know that explanation before Calloway's office does." The silence in the office was the particular silence of a man running out of a certain kind of room, not physical room, but the cognitive room that comes from believing, for long enough, that you've built a structure solid enough to hold. Solano had believed genuinely that his system worked because it had always worked. The people he'd stopped on that stretch of highway had, with a few exceptions, accepted what happened and moved on. Some out of exhaustion, some out of distrust of the process, some because they had no Colonel Carver to call, no federal flag on their credentials, no institutional machinery that recognized them as worth deploying on their behalf. He had read all of that as consent. as confirmation that he was right. It had never occurred to him that the absence of pushback was not the same thing as the absence of harm. "I need you to understand something," Getz said quietly. "The federal civil rights component changes the ceiling on this significantly. We are no longer talking about a misconduct complaint. We're talking about charges that carry real weight. And the IG investigation into the Army credential violation adds a layer that I do not have the clearance to fully advise you on, which means you may need a second attorney with different expertise." He paused. "And I need to know, is there anyone else in the department who participated in any of these stops or assisted in any of the documentation?" A long pause. "Participated how?" Solano said. Getz looked at him with the expression of a man who had just confirmed something he'd hoped he was wrong about. "Who else was involved, Derek?" Solano's jaw worked for a moment. "There's a sergeant," he said. "Harlan Price. He processed 3 of the seizure cases. He knew the items weren't being returned." Getz wrote the name down without reaction. "Anyone else?" "The watch commander on 2 of the nights was aware that charges were being dropped without documentation." "Name." Solano gave it. Getz wrote for another 30 seconds, then set the pen down. "I'm going to be very direct with you. The best available path forward involves full cooperation with the federal investigation, a complete accounting of all incidents, and an immediate acknowledgement that the stop last night was conducted improperly. Anything short of that, they will find anyway, and finding it without your cooperation makes the disposition significantly worse." "And if I cooperate fully?" "Then we negotiate from a position where you're giving them something rather than making them take everything." He met Solano's eyes. "But you need to decide now, because Calloway's office does not wait, and the window for cooperation to mean something is narrower than you think." Solano sat in his chair in a building in the town he'd worked for 11 years and thought about the smile, the one on the footage, the one he couldn't fully reconstruct from memory, and about the moment on that highway where he'd read her rank and made his calculation, and about the particular version of himself he'd been building since the first year on the job, the one who knew how the system worked and had arranged himself inside it accordingly. That version wasn't going to survive what was coming. He was only now beginning to understand that. "All right," he said, "tell me what cooperation looks like." Sergeant Harlan Price was notified by text at 1:14 p.m. that he was being placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. The text came from Captain Strand's office, which meant it had cleared at least one level of departmental review before it reached him. He read it twice, then called Solano. Solano didn't answer. He called the watch commander, the one Solano had named, though he didn't know that yet. The watch commander picked up and said 4 words, "Don't call me again," then hung up. Price sat in his car in the parking lot of a grocery store where he'd been picking up lunch, a bag of sandwiches on the passenger seat, and understood that whatever structure he'd operated inside was not intact anymore. He'd known Solano for 8 years. He'd processed those seizure cases because Solano had told him the items were being held pending additional investigation and that the documentation would be handled separately, and he'd filed it the way Solano said, because that was the pattern they'd developed and because questioning Solano had always cost more than it was worth. He had not, in 8 years, asked where the items went. That oversight was going to matter. He knew enough about how investigations worked to know that the people who stayed silent and waited to see how it landed were always worse off than the people who moved first. He sat with his sandwiches and his phone and the weight of 8 years of decisions that had felt, individually, like nothing much, like the ordinary friction of working inside a system with someone who moved confidently and told you things were handled. He called Strand's office. She picked up. He could hear from her tone that she'd been expecting the call. "Captain," he said, "I want to talk to you before anyone else." "My office," she said. 1 hour. At 2:47 p.m., Major Hargrove walked into the room where Nora was sitting with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she read through the preliminary IG report for the 3rd time. Hargrove set a tablet on the table in front of her without preamble. "Calloway just sent this." On the screen was a document, a formal charging memo, draft, bearing the DOJ Field Division letterhead. Nora read it. "Federal charges against Derek Solano, deprivation of rights under color of law, 4 counts. Evidence tampering, 2 counts. Civil rights violations under Section 242, 16 counts. 1 for each of the 16 incidents flagged in the false reporting category." Beneath the charging memo was a second document, shorter. Additional charges pending further review related to the 9 property seizure cases. She read through it twice. Then she set the tablet down. Is Price named? She asked. As a cooperating witness in the charging memo, not as a co-defendant. Not yet. The watch commander? Under review. Calloway is being careful about the scope. He doesn't want this to become something that collapses under its own weight in court. She understood that. A case that was too broad, that swept in too many defendants with too many degrees of culpability, became difficult to prosecute effectively. You had to build from the center and let the edges follow. Solano cooperated? She asked. Hargrove nodded. This morning, his attorney negotiated the terms. He gave them Price, the watch commander, and 3 incidents that weren't in the initial record pull. Incidents from before the database period Calloway had been searching. That pushed the total number of affected individuals to 51. 51. Nora thought about those 51 people. The ones still carrying whatever Solano had left them with. A record, a missing piece of equipment, a stop that had never made sense and never been explained. The ones who'd reported it and been told it was resolved. The ones who hadn't bothered to report it because they'd run the calculation and found it didn't add up. I want to be in the room, she said, when the charges are formally presented. That's not typically... I know it's not typical. I'm asking. Hargrove looked at her. There was something in her expression that Nora recognized. The tension between the institutional answer and the human one. The correct procedure said Nora's role was as a witness and complainant, not a participant in the charging process. The human answer said this woman had been handcuffed on a desert highway and had stabilized 4 casualties within 3 hours of that, and had spent the night giving testimony and had just read a document listing 51 people who were owed something they hadn't gotten yet. I'll talk to Calloway, Hargrove said. Thank you. Hargrove picked up the tablet. Paused. There's one more thing. The 9 people whose property was seized and never returned, Calloway's team has located and contacted all 9. 8 of them are willing to speak on record. The 9th? She stopped. What about the 9th? The 9th was a veteran. He was stopped 14 months ago. He was held for 6 hours on a charge that was subsequently dropped. During the hold, a specialized medical device was seized, the kind issued by the VA for a specific post-service condition. He never got it back. He filed a complaint. It was marked resolved. Hargrove's voice was steady, but the steadiness required effort. He stopped filing complaints 8 months ago. His family says he got tired of being told things were handled. Nora sat very still. His name is Marcus Teller, Hargrove said. He's 54. He lives 20 miles from here. She set the tablet down again. He's willing to testify, but he said he needs to know someone is actually listening. He said he's been told so many times that people were listening that he can't tell the difference anymore. Nora looked at the cold coffee in her cup. She looked at the IG report. She looked at the window where the afternoon light was coming in flat and clear off the Fort Mercer parade ground. I want to call him, she said. Me. Personally. Not a legal office, not a caseworker. I want him to hear it from someone who was also on that highway. Hargrove held her gaze. I'll get you his number. She left the room. Nora sat alone for a moment, running through what she was going to say to a man who had stopped believing that any of this worked, trying to find the words that were true without being false, that acknowledged the brokenness of it without pretending it could be fixed by words alone. She was still working on it when her phone lit up. Not Hargrove, not Okafor, not Calloway. A number she didn't recognize, different from the 3 a.m. message, different area code, different pattern, and a message that was longer than 3 words this time, long enough to read twice, then a third time before the meaning assembled itself fully. It said, Captain Vesey, my name is Adrienne Colt. I'm a staff reporter with the Federal Record. I've received documentation related to the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department investigation from a source I cannot identify. I have 47 pages. Before I publish, I want to give you the opportunity to speak on record. I'm not asking about classified information. I'm asking about what it means to be a person in a uniform that someone decided didn't count. I think you're the right person to answer that. My number is above. I'm asking you to call before 6 p.m. today. Nora read it a third time. The documentation this reporter had received, 47 pages, was not nothing. It was specific enough to suggest a source with access, and specific enough to suggest that whatever Calloway's office and the IG's process intended to do carefully and incrementally was about to be overtaken by something that moved on a different timeline entirely, the timeline of publication. She looked at the clock. It was 3:19 p.m. She had 2 hours and 41 minutes, and somewhere in Calloway's office, a person she hadn't yet identified had made a decision, for reasons she didn't fully understand, that the careful, controlled machinery of institutional accountability was not going to be enough, and that something else needed to be moving at the same time, something that couldn't be negotiated down or procedurally delayed or quietly resolved in a room full of people who had institutional interests in the scope of the resolution. Whether that decision was right or wrong, she didn't know yet. But she knew she had to decide what to do with it in the next 2 hours and 41 minutes, and that whatever she decided, it was going to determine the shape of everything that came after. She picked up her phone. She called Okafor first. Not Calloway, not Hargrove, Okafor, because Okafor was the person in this chain who had spoken to her like a human being inside a legal framework, rather than a legal framework with a human being attached, and because the decision she was about to make had legal implications that she needed assessed in the next 10 minutes, not the next 10 hours. Okafor picked up on the second ring. Nora read her the message verbatim. Silence on the other end. The careful kind. "How many people have access to 47 pages of documentation on this case?" Nora asked. "At this stage?" "The IG office, Calloway's team, Department Legal, and anyone those individuals communicated with." A pause. "And Solano's attorney received a document summary as part of the cooperation negotiation this morning." "Getz's office." "Yes." "So the leak could be from inside the department's own legal defense." "It could be from several places," Okafor said carefully. "The question for you right now is not where it came from. The question is what you do about the call you've been asked to make." Nora was already working through it. Speaking to the press before federal charges were formally filed was a category of action with specific implications. It could affect the shape of the trial. It could be characterized as prejudicing the jury pool. It could give Solano's attorney a procedural argument that benefited no one except Solano. Against that, a reporter with 47 pages was publishing with or without her, and a story told without her perspective was a story shaped by whatever the 47 pages said and whoever had framed them. "If I speak to her," Nora said, "what are my constraints?" "No classified material, nothing about the specific nature of your assignment last week, nothing that constitutes testimony about specific evidentiary details not yet in the public record." Another pause. "But your personal experience, what happened to you on that highway, as a person, not as a classified asset, that is yours. No one can tell you not to speak about what happened to your own body and your own property and your own record. And the other 50 people? Their stories are theirs. You can speak to the existence of a pattern without characterizing individual cases. You can say that you're not the only one." Nora looked at the clock, 3:26 p.m. "I'm going to call her." "I know," Okafor said. "I'd have done the same. Call me after." She hung up and dialed Adrienne Colt. The reporter answered before the first ring completed, which told Nora she'd been holding the phone. Her voice was measured, but underneath it was the particular energy of someone who had been sitting on something significant and had been waiting, with discipline, for the right moment. "Captain Vess." "Thank you." "I have conditions," Nora said. "I'd expect that. I don't speak to classified material. I don't characterize other individuals' cases beyond confirming that a pattern exists. And I am not your lead. The lead is the 47 people who were on that highway before me and didn't have the institutional weight to make this move." A beat. "That's a generous framing for yourself." "It's an accurate one. What do you have?" "Stop records, internal complaint logs, evidence intake and disposal discrepancies, and the body camera footage timestamp analysis showing the 18-minute gap between your ID returning clean and the impersonation charge being filed. I also have a source who can speak to Solano's conduct being known internally at a supervisory level for at least 3 years. 3 years. Nora processed that. If a supervisor had known, had documentation, had complaints, had any form of institutional awareness, and had not acted, the accountability didn't stop with Solano. It extended up, and the extension changed the nature of the case from an individual misconduct investigation to something structural. That last part, Nora said, The supervisory awareness. You're confident? My source is documented and on record with me. They're not identified in the story, but I've verified what they're telling me against the complaint logs. 3 formal complaints in 4 years, all marked resolved at the supervisory level without escalation. By whom? That's in the story, Colt said. I'm not going to give it to you before publication because that's not how this works. But you'll see it when it goes up. Nora was quiet for a moment. She was running the implications. A supervisor who had received and buried complaints was, in the language of the federal investigation, a material witness at minimum and a potential co-conspirator at maximum. Calloway's office likely didn't have this yet, or had it in a form that hadn't been fully connected to the supervisory layer. When are you publishing? She asked. Tonight, 8 p.m., with or without you. I'll speak to you, on record. 1 hour, and I'll tell you what it means to be a person in a uniform someone decided didn't count. That's all I need, Colt said. They spoke for 54 minutes, by phone, with Nora sitting at the desk in the transient quarters with the door closed and a notepad in front of her that she didn't write on. She didn't need notes. She knew what she wanted to say. She told Colt about the stop the way she had told Major Foss, in sequence, with precision, but differently, because this was a different kind of telling. Legal testimony was built for accuracy. This was built for understanding. She described what it felt like to stand on that shoulder with her hands on a car roof, in a uniform she had earned through 8 years of service, while a man read her rank and made a decision that her rank didn't apply. She described the badge, not as a federal credential, not in the language of the investigation, but as an object that had been clipped to her uniform for 2 years, that had crossed into and out of 3 countries and 2 combat support theaters, and that had been removed by a man who had decided it was costume jewelry. She was careful. She stayed within Okafor's constraints. She didn't editorialize about the specific charges or the federal investigation or Solano's legal situation, but she spoke about the pattern, about the shape of it, about what it meant that this highway had been operating as a space where people in uniform could be stripped of the authority their country had given them by someone who had made a prior determination about what kind of person they were. Do you think he knew he was wrong? Colt asked, near the end. Nora considered this for longer than she'd considered most of the questions. I think he knew the evidence didn't support what he was doing, she said. I think knowing something is wrong and doing it anyway is a decision. It's not confusion. It's not mistake. It's a decision. And the system that let him do it for 4 years? That's a different question. The system made it possible by treating his reports as the end of the inquiry rather than the beginning. Accountability doesn't start with the individual. It starts with the culture that tells the individual what happens when they cross a line. If nothing happens when you cross a line, that's information. That's the system telling you the line isn't real. Colt was quiet for a moment. That's the quote, she said. Then use it, Nora said. The article went up at 8:03 p.m. under the headline, Decorated Army Nurse Detained, Badge Seized. Federal Investigation Reveals Decades of Targeting Military Personnel on Caldwell Highway. The Federal Record's digital edition loaded slowly for the first 11 minutes because traffic spiked before the server infrastructure compensated. By 8:30 p.m., it had been shared 1,700 times. By 9:15 p.m., a national wire service had picked up the summary. Nora didn't watch it happen in real time. She was on the phone with Marcus Teller. He'd answered after 4 rings, with the voice of someone who'd been screening calls for long enough that answering felt like a small risk each time. She'd introduced herself simply, her name, her rank, the fact that she'd been on the same highway he'd been on 14 months ago. She didn't oversell it. She didn't promise him things she couldn't deliver. I know what happened to your device, she said. I know it wasn't returned. I know you filed a complaint and were told it was resolved and it wasn't. I'm calling because someone should have called a long time ago, and I'm sorry they didn't. A long silence on the other end, the kind that wasn't hostile, just the silence of someone deciding whether the call was real. They told me resolved meant they'd looked into it, Teller said finally. His voice was even, measured, the voice of a man who'd had to become economical with his feelings because spending them hadn't returned anything. I asked 3 times what looking into it meant. Nobody could tell me. It meant they closed the file, Nora said. That's all it meant. It didn't mean they investigated. It meant they stopped the clock on the complaint. Another silence. So it was never going to come back. Not through that channel. No. Why are you telling me this now? It was a fair question, and it deserved a fair answer. Because there's a federal investigation open. Because Solano is cooperating. Because the device is in the evidence log from your stop, and there's a chain of custody that can be reconstructed. And because I needed you to know that what happened to you is part of a case that people are taking seriously, and that your testimony, if you're willing to give it, will be part of what determines how this ends. My testimony about a device. Your testimony about what it means when someone in authority takes something that belongs to you and the system tells you it's been handled and nothing comes back. That's the testimony. That's what matters. He was quiet for so long that she almost said something to fill it. She didn't. Okay, he said. Okay. Who do I call? She gave him Okafor's number. She stayed on the line while he wrote it down, and then she told him one more thing. Thank you, Mr. Teller, for picking up. You're the first person who made it sound like picking up was worth something, he said, and hung up. She sat with the phone in her lap for a moment. Then Hargrove knocked and opened the door simultaneously, which she only did when something had moved fast. The article is up. I know. Calloway's office called. He's not angry. Good. He said, and I'm quoting, whoever talked to the Federal Record did us a favor, because the supervisory complaint information in that article is going to require me to expand the investigation to include Captain Strand's office, and I was going to need a reason to do that anyway. Nora looked up. Strand knew. 3 complaints in 4 years, all resolved at her level. The article sourced it from the complaint logs. Calloway's team is pulling her records tonight. Hargrove leaned against the doorframe. This is going to be bigger than Solano. It was always bigger than Solano, Nora said. Solano was just the one who made it visible. The following 72 hours moved. The way institutional processes moved when they finally had enough pressure on them. Not smoothly, not quickly, but with a grinding inevitability that was its own kind of momentum. Derek Solano was formally charged on the morning of the second day. The charges were read at the Caldwell County Federal Courthouse in a proceeding that lasted 19 minutes and was attended by 8 reporters, 2 representatives from veterans advocacy organizations who had driven in after seeing the Federal Record article, and Captain Rhea Strand, who arrived in civilian clothes and sat in the back row and left before the proceeding was finished because she had a meeting with her own attorney at noon. Solano appeared in a gray suit that didn't fit quite right across the shoulders. The suit of a man who wore a uniform so consistently that civilian clothes had become a foreign language. He listened to the charges read aloud with the expression of someone trying to maintain a specific configuration of their face. He didn't look at the gallery. His attorney entered a not guilty plea, which was procedurally expected and tactically irrelevant given the cooperation agreement, and the whole proceeding had the particular quality of a formality that everyone in the room understood was preliminary to something much larger. Nora was not in the courtroom. She was at Fort Mercer, in a conference room with Okafor and 2 Army JAG attorneys who had been brought in specifically to address the federal credential component of the case, the part that extended beyond local misconduct into matters that touched military security clearance protocols. The meeting lasted 4 hours. It was detailed and procedural, and at several points, repetitive, in the way that legal processes were repetitive, because repetition was how institutional memory was built. She answered the same questions she had answered before, and she answered them the same way, because consistency was the architecture of credibility. At the end of the 4 hours, one of the JAG attorneys, a lieutenant colonel named Whitmore, who had said relatively little for most of the meeting, looked at her and said, "Captain Vess, I want to be direct with you. The credential component of this case is going to result in a formal security review of the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department's handling of military personnel. That's a process that will take time and will involve recommendations at the departmental level. Some of those recommendations will be mandatory, meaning there are people in that department who are going to lose their positions as a result of this. Not just Solano. The scope of the security review makes that outcome very likely." She heard him. She took a moment with it. Not celebration, not exactly, but something like the particular weight of understanding that consequence was real. "How many people are we talking about?" Whitmore looked at his notes. "Currently?" "Solano, and depending on the findings of the Strand review, potentially 3 to 5 additional personnel who had supervisory visibility into the stop records. He paused. The watch commander is cooperating. Price is cooperating. Both have provided documentation that goes above their own level in the command structure. Above Strand? That's what I'm not at liberty to tell you yet, Whitmore said. But the review has expanded. She nodded. She thought about the system that tells someone the line isn't real. She thought about how far up that lesson had to travel before someone taught it. On the third day, something happened that no one had fully anticipated. Corporal Darius Holt was discharged from the civilian hospital at Northgate Medical with a repair to his left lung, 4 cracked ribs, and a look on his face that suggested he intended to be back on duty before his doctors thought appropriate. He came to Fort Mercer not because anyone had asked him to, but because he'd heard what had happened, the article, the charges, the investigation, and had a specific thing he needed to do. Nora was crossing the parade ground when he appeared at the edge of it, civilian clothes, one arm slightly stiff from the surgical site, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been told to take it easy and was taking it as easy as they intended to. "Captain Vess," he said. She stopped. "Corporal Holt, you should be resting." "I know, ma'am." He looked like he was working up to something. He had the face of a young man who was not accustomed to not knowing what to say. "I wanted to find you before I heard you were gone. I wanted to tell you—" He stopped, started again. "I know what a tension pneumothorax does if you don't decompress it. My uncle had one. He didn't make it." His jaw worked for a moment. "I just needed to say thank you. In person." She looked at him. He was 22 years old and had a repaired lung and had driven to a military base in civilian clothes to say thank you in person, and there was something about that, about the precision of what it cost him to be there and the fact that he'd done it anyway. That sat differently than most things sat. "You told me your name," she said, "while I was working on you, Darius, like you needed me to know." "I did need you to know," he said simply. "Then we're even," she said. "Take care of that lung." He nodded. He started to turn away, then stopped. "The man who arrested you," he said. "Before all this? He's going to be charged." "He already is." Something moved across his face. Relief, but complicated. The kind that came from understanding that a system had failed and was being corrected, which was better than the alternative, but wasn't the same as the system not having failed. "Good," he said, and meant it in that complicated way. She watched him walk back across the parade ground, careful and stiff, and 22. The Federal Record published a follow-up piece on day 4. This one was different from the first, less narrative, more institutional. It detailed the 3 formal complaints that had been filed against Solano over 4 years and resolved at Captain Strand's level without escalation. It included, with Strand's name clearly attached, an internal memo from 19 months prior in which she had noted, in her own words, that Solano's stop rates in the highway corridor were above department average, but had characterized this as evidence of diligent patrol activity. The memo had been obtained through a public records request that Colt had apparently filed weeks before the Vess incident, which meant the reporter had been building this story before anyone on the official side knew they were building a case. Strand issued a statement through her attorney at noon on day 4. The statement said she had followed department protocol in addressing the complaints, and that any characterization of her conduct as negligent or complicit was inaccurate. The statement was 6 sentences long and satisfied no one. By 3 p.m. on day 4, 3 of the 51 identified individuals had given on-record statements to Calloway's office. 2 more had agreed to testify. Marcus Teller had sent in written documentation of his complaint and the device that had never been returned, and Okafor had confirmed that the device had been located in a storage inventory associated with Solano's evidence logs, still sealed, never processed for disposal, never returned. It had been sitting in a metal shelf in a Caldwell County evidence room for 14 months. The device would be returned to Teller by the end of the week. That was a small thing in the accounting of everything, but it was also, depending on how you looked at it, the most concrete thing, the one piece of evidence that made the abstract claim of a pattern into a physical, returnable object with a name on it. On day 5, Calloway's office subpoenaed Strand's communication records. On day 6, Strand retained a second attorney. The department issued a statement on day 6 as well, through the County Public Affairs Office, expressing full cooperation with the ongoing federal and military investigations, and noting that the department was committed to reviewing its internal complaint resolution processes. It was the kind of statement that was designed to neither admit nor deny anything, and it accomplished that goal completely. It also accomplished nothing else. Nora received the badge back on the afternoon of day 5. It was returned to her by Major Foss in a formal handover that involved documented chain of custody paperwork and 2 witnesses. The badge came in an evidence bag, which was opened in front of her and then set on the table between them. The clasp that Solano had broken when he ripped it off her uniform had been replaced. New hardware, matching specifications, by someone in Calloway's office who had apparently thought to do this without being asked. She picked it up. It looked the same. It felt the same. The weight of it was unchanged, and so was the surface, still carrying the minor scratches that had accumulated over 2 years of being clipped and unclipped and carried across distances that the badge itself couldn't document. "The chain of custody documentation goes into your file," Foss said. "The unauthorized removal is formally noted as part of the federal record. You'll receive a copy of all documentation by end of business tomorrow." "Thank you," Nora said. She held the badge for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Not sentimentally, more the way you held something that had been through something with you and had come back, changed in ways you couldn't quite name. Then she clipped it back onto her uniform. It caught on the first try. She didn't make anything of it. She just moved on to the next thing. On the evening of day 6, Derek Solano sat in his attorney's office for the 3rd time that week and reviewed the terms of his cooperation agreement in detail. The agreement was 14 pages. He had read it enough times that he no longer needed to read it carefully. He read it carefully anyway, because there was nothing else useful to do. Warren Getz sat across from him in the particular silence of an attorney who has done everything available to be done and is now waiting for the client to finish processing. He had, over the past 6 days, developed a guarded respect for the Solano case's investigative efficiency. Not for Solano, but for the machinery that had assembled itself around the incident with a speed that suggested prior preparation, as though multiple institutional systems had been waiting for exactly this kind of trigger. "The Strand subpoena," Solano said, not looking up from the agreement. "Yes. If they find what I think they're going to find in her communications, then the scope of the charges expands upward," Getz said, "and your cooperation becomes more valuable, not less, because you're providing information that's leading them somewhere they didn't fully expect to go." Solano set the agreement down. He looked at the table, at the surface of it, at the grain of the wood, at nothing in particular. "I thought she was powerless," he said. It wasn't an explanation, and it wasn't an apology. It was just a statement of the fact that had been the load-bearing wall of his mistake. "I read every credential she had, and I thought she was powerless." Getz did not respond to this because there was nothing useful to say in response to it. "She saved 4 people on the same highway where I arrested her," Solano said, 3 hours later. "I know. I saw it in the scene report, the one Calloway's office attached to the evidence package." He picked up the agreement again. "I didn't know she was going to do that when I filed the charges, but I knew who she was." "Derek, I knew who she was," he said again. "That's the thing. I knew before I filed. I knew when I pulled the badge off her uniform. He stopped. "I thought the knowing didn't matter. I thought the system was mine to decide what mattered." Getz was quiet. "It wasn't, though," Solano said. He signed the cooperation agreement on page 14. The pen scratched against the paper in the quiet office, and outside the window the evening was coming down over Caldwell Junction in the particular way it came down in high desert country. Fast, total, unambiguous. At 9:47 p.m. on day 6, Calloway's lead analyst completed the review of Strand's communication records. The analyst flagged 17 exchanges. 12 were between Strand and Solano, spanning 31 months, discussing specific complaints in language that made clear she understood what the complaints meant, and had made a determination to classify them as resolved without action. 5 were between Strand and the watch commander, the same watch commander who was now cooperating, in which the management of the complaint process was discussed in terms that would not read well to a federal judge. The analyst flagged one exchange in particular and marked it for immediate review. It was an email sent by Strand to the watch commander 14 months ago, 3 days after Marcus Teller filed his complaint about the seized medical device. The email was 4 sentences. The 4th sentence said, "If this one goes up the chain, it becomes a pattern, and a pattern becomes something we can't manage internally. Handle it the same way." The analyst read it twice, then called Calloway. Calloway read it once. Then he picked up his phone and made 2 calls, one to the DOJ field office and one to Okafor's direct line, which he'd been given specifically for situations that needed to move faster than regular channels. "I need to talk to Captain Vest tonight," he said when Okafor answered. About? About the fact that we're no longer talking about one officer or one supervisor. We're talking about a deliberate system of suppression that was managed at the command level, and that the primary evidence for that system is an email that references her complainant by implication. He paused. Marcus Teller's complaint was the one that triggered the email. That makes him a material witness in a case that's substantially larger than a property seizure. He needs to know that tonight, and Vess needs to be the one to tell him, because he'll take it from her. Okafor said she'd get Nora on the phone. 3 minutes later, Nora was reading the email that Calloway had sent to her secure account. She read it once, and the 4th sentence landed the way specific sentences sometimes landed, not with surprise, because she'd known the shape of this since Hargrove said the word supervisory, but with the particular weight of having the shape confirmed in someone's actual words, in an email with a timestamp and a sender address, and the kind of irreversible existence that came from being stored on a server that federal investigators now had access to. Handle it the same way. 4 words that had turned a man's medical device into an unclaimed item on a shelf for 14 months. She looked at Okafor. "I'll call Teller." "Calloway wants to know if you're prepared for what comes next," Okafor said. "This changes the testimony scope. This changes the trial shape. This potentially changes the number of defendants." "How many?" Nora asked. 3 confirmed, possibly 5, depending on the watch commander's full cooperation. "When do the expanded charges get filed?" Calloway said he needs 48 hours to complete the evidentiary review. Charges will be filed by end of week. Nora nodded. She looked at the email on her screen one more time, at the 4th sentence, at the name above it, Strand R. Captain, Caldwell County Sheriff's Department, and the timestamp that said 10:22 p.m. on a Tuesday 14 months ago, when someone in authority had read a complaint from a veteran about a stolen medical device and decided the threat was not to the veteran, but to the system that had taken it. She closed the email and picked up her phone to call Marcus Teller. She was halfway through dialing when a new message appeared on her screen. Not her phone, not secure email, but the General Base Communications System, forwarded from the Fort Mercer Public Affairs Office, flagged urgent. It was a press inquiry from a television network. They were requesting a statement about a document they had just received, a document that was not the federal record's 47 pages, was not the body camera footage, was not any of the materials currently in Calloway's possession. It was a personnel file. Nora's personnel file, specifically the classified portions of it, which should not have been accessible to a television network under any circumstances, and which contained details about her assignment history that had nothing to do with the Solano case and everything to do with work she had done that was supposed to remain invisible. Someone had leaked her classified personnel file, and whoever had done it, it wasn't Calloway's office, and it wasn't Colt, and it wasn't anyone who was on her side of this. She didn't panic. That was the first thing, the absence of panic, which was not the same as the absence of alarm, but was the difference between a person who had been trained to function inside emergencies and a person who hadn't. The press inquiry was on her screen. The classified personnel file was in a television network's possession. Those were facts. She had approximately 45 seconds before she needed to do something with them. She called Hargrove. "I need you now," she said when Hargrove answered. "My classified personnel file has been leaked to a television network. They're requesting a statement." A beat. "Which network?" "National Horizon News. The inquiry came through Base Public Affairs, flagged urgent, timestamp 9 minutes ago." "Don't respond. Don't confirm. Don't deny. Don't acknowledge you received it. I'm calling Base Security and Calloway simultaneously. Stay where you are." The line went dead. Nora set the phone down and thought, with deliberate focus, about who had access to her classified file and who had a reason to use it. The file itself was held at 2 levels. The General Military Personnel System, which was secured but accessible to a range of authorized users, and a secondary classification tier that covered her specific assignment history, which was accessible to substantially fewer people. The fact that the network had the classified portions narrowed the source considerably. Calloway's office didn't have her file. They'd operated through the IG and the JAG, through channels that touched her public record but not her classified assignment history. Okafor had portions of her general record. Hargrove had the full personnel file by virtue of being her commanding officer. The Pentagon's medical command desk, which Carver had contacted from the highway, had been notified of her identity and her assignment, but would not have transmitted a classified file to a civilian network. That left two categories. Someone within the military personnel system who had pulled the file with authorization and leaked it out, which required both access and motive, or someone adjacent to the Solano case who had acquired the file through a different channel and was deploying it now, on day 6, when the charges were expanding and the pressure was highest. She thought about the 4 sentences in Strand's email. Handle it the same way. She thought about someone watching the case build over 6 days, watching Solano cooperate, watching the subpoena land on Strand's communications, watching the walls close. She thought about what a person in that position might do with a classified personnel file if they had it. Hargrove was back in 12 minutes. She came through the door of the transient quarters without knocking, which meant something had moved fast. Base security has contacted the network's legal department. The inquiry has been frozen pending a security review. Publishing any classified material is a federal violation, and the network knows that. They made the inquiry specifically to have the opportunity to pull back before they made that mistake. Hargrove pulled the chair from the desk and sat down across from her. The question is the source. I've been thinking about that, Nora said. So has Calloway. He called me 40 seconds after you did. He has a working hypothesis. Tell me. The watch commander, Hargrove said. The one who's been cooperating. His cooperation agreement was conditioned on full disclosure of everything he was aware of. But his attorney negotiated a specific carve-out 3 days ago. He would not be required to identify any party outside the department who had been provided information from Solano's stop records. Nora looked at her. Someone outside the department had access to the stop records. Had access, and apparently had more than that. Hargrove's voice was level, but there was something underneath it. The particular tension of someone who has just understood that a problem is larger than its original footprint. Calloway thinks the personnel file came from outside the military system. He thinks someone with access to Solano's operation, not just the stops, but the files, the stored property, the evidence logs, had been feeding information to a third party, and that third party had resources that went beyond a county sheriff's department. Who? That's what Calloway is working on tonight. She paused. Nora, this file leak is not a last-ditch defensive move. It's too sophisticated for that. Someone pulled a classified personnel file, not a general record, the classified tier, and placed it with a network that has a federal legal department careful enough to make an inquiry before publishing. That takes either extraordinary access or extraordinary resources to acquire access. Or both, Nora said. Or both. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the base was doing what bases did at night. Vehicles moving, perimeter checks. The particular low hum of an institution that didn't fully stop. Nora looked at the badge on her uniform, clipped back in its place since afternoon, and thought about the shape of what she was in the middle of, how it had started as a traffic stop and had expanded outward in every direction until it touched things she hadn't known were connected. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "Nothing tonight," Hargrove said. "Tonight you let Calloway work. Tomorrow." She stopped. "Tomorrow?" "Tomorrow Calloway wants a meeting. Not the IG office, not the JAG team. Him, you, and 2 people from an office. I'm not clear to name specifically. Pentagon level, Nora said. Yes. She nodded. She'd known, from the moment Carver had gotten on the satellite phone on that highway, that there was a ceiling above which she didn't have full visibility. She'd operated within what she could see and trusted that the parts she couldn't see were being managed by people who had the clearance to manage them. Now those parts were becoming visible, one by one, and each one changed the shape of the whole. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow." Hargrove stood. At the door, she paused, and something in her expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. "You handled today well," she said. "Teller, the testimony, the article, the badge. All of it." "I handled today adequately," Nora said. "There's a difference." Hargrove looked at her for a moment. "You always say that." "Because it's always true." "Maybe," Hargrove said. "But tonight I'll allow it to sound like modesty instead of accuracy." She left. Nora sat alone in the quiet room for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, which was its own kind of recovery. The meeting the next morning was in a building on the far side of the base that Nora had been in once before, for an entirely different reason. It had no signage outside. It had a security checkpoint inside the main entrance that was more thorough than the standard base protocol. The two people from the office Hargrove hadn't named were a man named Aldrin, who had no title that he offered, and a woman named Specialist Graves, who did most of the talking. Calloway was already there when Nora arrived. He looked like he'd slept 3 hours, which she suspected was accurate, and he had a folder in front of him that was thick enough to have required effort to carry. Graves opened without preamble. "The personnel file leak has been traced to a data broker operating under a corporate identity registered in 2 states. The broker acquired your file through a compromised contractor account in the military personnel system, an account belonging to an administrative specialist who was terminated for unrelated reasons 4 months ago, but whose credentials were not fully deactivated in the system." "A ghost account," Nora said. "Effectively, the broker sold the file to an intermediary who placed it with the network as leverage, specifically timed to coincide with the expansion of the federal investigation into the Strand communications." Graves looked at her with the focused attention of someone conveying information efficiently. "The intent was to redirect public attention from the departmental misconduct to questions about your assignment history, to make the story about you rather than about the pattern." "Who hired the broker?" "We're 48 hours from a confident answer on that, but the financial trail connects to a private security contractor with several county government contracts in this region, including a contract with the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department for training services." Nora looked at Calloway. He gave her a small, precise nod that said, "Yes, this is as bad as it sounds." "The contractor has financial relationships with at least 3 individuals currently under investigation," Graves continued. "The watch commander, the second-named supervisor in the Strand communications, and a county commissioner who approved the training contracts." A county commissioner. The threat had traveled from a traffic stop on a desert highway through a law enforcement department, through a private contractor to an elected official who had signed checks and asked no questions or asked the wrong ones. "Is this going to slow the Solano charges?" Nora asked. "No," Calloway said. "Solano's charges proceed on schedule. Strand's expanded charges proceed. The contractor investigation runs parallel. It doesn't replace what's already in motion, it adds to it." "The network that received the file." "They're cooperating," Graves said. "They've turned over all communications regarding the file's receipt. The reporter who received it has agreed to testify about the circumstances. Nobody wants to be on the wrong end of a classified information violation." Nora sat with all of it for a moment. She thought about mile 62, about the moment the badge had come off her uniform, about the calculation she'd run on the side of the road, the one that had identified this as a serious problem without knowing how serious, without knowing that the man who'd cuffed her was operating inside a structure that extended into contractor relationships and county government and compromised personnel databases. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Aldrin spoke for the first time. He had a quiet voice and a specific kind of stillness that came from operating in environments where drawing attention had consequences. "We need you to be patient," he said. "The next phase of this is going to move more slowly than the first phase, because it's moving through different institutions with different timelines. And there's going to be a period, probably 2 to 3 weeks, where it looks from the outside like things have stalled. They haven't, but it will look that way. And during that period, you return to duty, you continue your assignment, you don't make additional public statements." He paused. "And you trust that the machinery is moving." She thought about Marcus Teller, who had trusted that the machinery was moving for 14 months, and had watched it sit still. She thought about the 25 other people who had filed complaints that went nowhere. She thought about the word trust and what it required and what it cost. "I'll be patient," she said, "but I want regular updates. Not through channels, through Okafor, directly to me. I want to know when each charge is filed, when each defendant is processed, when the contractor investigation produces an indictment. I'm not asking to run this. I'm asking to watch it." Aldrin looked at Graves. Something passed between them. "Agreed," Graves said. The patience required turned out to be 22 days, not 2 to 3 weeks, which Nora counted as a minor institutional efficiency miracle. In those 22 days, she returned to duty, completed the debrief she'd missed on the night of the accident, and resumed her work with the 44th Medical Response Group, as though the previous weeks had been a weather event, something that had passed through and left marks but hadn't changed the fundamental operation. Her wrist healed. The headaches stopped. Corporal Holt sent her a message from his recovery unit that said only, "Getting cleared to return to duty next week. Thank you again, Captain." She wrote back, "Take care of that lung, Corporal." He responded with a thumbs up. Yara Ose sent a longer message, 3 paragraphs, slightly formal, in the way of someone who wasn't sure of the right register for thanking a person who had pulled you out of an overturned vehicle. Nora wrote back in kind. By the third exchange, they had found a more natural rhythm, and it became, in its modest way, a correspondence. She called Marcus Teller twice during the 22 days. The first call was to confirm that his medical device had been processed for return and that he'd receive it within the week. The second was a shorter call, 3 days later, just to confirm he'd received it and to ask whether he'd made contact with Okafor about the testimony process. He had. He sounded different on the second call. Not healed, not resolved, but marginally less brittle. Like someone who had set down something heavy and was still figuring out how to walk without it. "Does it help?" she asked him, "knowing where it's going?" "Some," he said. "Knowing and seeing are different things." "You'll see it," she said. "You sure about that?" "I'm sure that what they have is enough," she said. "And I'm sure that you getting your device back was documented in a federal case file. That's not nothing. That's the record saying it happened and it mattered." He was quiet for a moment. "I never thought a phone call was going to make any difference," he said. "I thought that was just something people said." "Sometimes it's just something people say," she agreed. This time it was also the thing that was true. She meant it. It was imprecise and she knew it, and she meant it anyway, because the work of justice was often imprecise at the edges, even when it was rigorous at the center, and the edges were where people actually lived. On day 19, Harlan Price testified before a federal grand jury for 4 hours. His testimony covered the 3 seizure cases he had processed, his knowledge of the evidence disposal irregularities, and a specific conversation with Solano that had taken place 8 months before the Vess incident, in which Solano had told him, in language that Price now repeated with the careful precision of someone who had been coached on how to recount a conversation accurately. "The people we're stopping out there don't have anyone to call. That's the point. You don't worry about people who don't have anyone to call." That sentence became part of the public record when the grand jury proceedings were summarized in Calloway's press briefing on day 21. It ran in the Federal Record the next morning. Adrienne Colt wrote the piece herself, and she framed it the way Nora had framed it in their phone call 3 weeks prior. Not as a story about one officer, but as a story about what a system communicates when it decides that some people don't have anyone to call and treats that as an operational feature rather than a failure. The piece was the most read article the Federal Record had published in 4 years. Nora knew this because Colt texted her the metrics, without asking for a response, as a piece of information delivered to someone who had contributed to the thing and deserved to know its reach. She read the piece once, in full, at 6 a.m. on day 22. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went to work. The formal charges were expanded on day 22. Calloway held a press briefing at 2 p.m. in the federal building in the nearest city large enough to have one. He stood at a podium with a DOJ seal behind him and read a list of names and charges in the measured, deliberately untheatrical voice of someone who understood that the theatrical quality of justice was in its substance, not its presentation. Derek Solano. Deprivation of rights under color of law. Evidence tampering. Civil rights violations. 16 counts. Plea agreement confirmed. Cooperation with federal investigation. Rhea Strand. Deprivation of rights under color of law, obstruction of justice, 3 counts of official misconduct. No plea agreement, full prosecution. Watch Commander Lieutenant Dale Ferris. 2 counts of official misconduct, 1 count of obstruction. Cooperation agreement, terms pending. Harlan Price. 1 count of evidence mishandling. cooperation witness, charges contingent on full testimony compliance, and then separated from the departmental charges by a brief pause that Calloway used to turn a page. 3 individuals associated with Halloran Security Services, the private contractor. 2 counts of conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation. 1 count related to the unauthorized acquisition and distribution of classified military personnel records. County Commissioner Russell Eild. 1 count of misconduct in office. 1 count of failure to report known criminal activity, under separate investigation by the State Attorney General's office. The briefing lasted 27 minutes. Calloway took 6 questions and declined to answer 4 of them on grounds that the investigation was ongoing. He thanked the Army Inspector General's office, the JAG team, and the cooperation of all individuals who came forward to provide testimony in the interest of a complete accounting. He did not name Nora. She'd asked him not to, specifically. She hadn't wanted her name in the charging announcement, didn't want the story of the charges to be organized around her rather than around the 51 people whose experience made the charges possible. Calloway had agreed without argument, which told her he'd already understood the instinct. She watched the briefing live stream on her laptop in her office at Fort Mercer with the door closed and a cup of coffee that she actually remembered to drink. When it ended, she sat for a while in the particular quiet that followed resolution. Not silence, because the base was never fully silent, but the inner quiet of a person who has been carrying something forward with effort and has arrived somewhere. It wasn't a triumphant feeling. She'd thought it might be, and it wasn't. It was more complicated than that. The satisfaction of something done correctly running alongside the knowledge of everything the correctness had cost, and the awareness that the people who'd needed this outcome for years had gotten it now, and not then, and that the gap between then and now was real and permanent, and not erased by the outcome, however complete the outcome was. She thought about the system that tells people the line isn't real. She thought about the system that had told 51 people their complaints were resolved. She thought about the version of this that existed in other places, on other highways, in other corridors where someone had arranged the conditions so that certain people arrived without anyone to call. She wasn't naive enough to believe that charging Solano and Strand and Ferris and the contractor eliminated the version that existed elsewhere. She was experienced enough to know that it demonstrated something, though, that when the conditions were right and the documentation was sufficient and the institutional machinery was pointed in the correct direction, the line was real. The line had consequences. The line held. That was worth something. She knew it was worth something because she'd seen what it looked like when it wasn't. 3 weeks after the briefing, she received a letter. It was formal, on Army letterhead, bearing the signature of a 2-star general she had never met. It informed her that in recognition of her conduct on the night of the Highway 7 accident, specifically her provision of emergency trauma care under adverse circumstances that directly preserved the lives of multiple Army personnel, and in recognition of her subsequent cooperation with the Army Inspector General investigation and the federal civil rights case, she was being recommended for the Army Commendation Medal with a citation noting extraordinary service above and beyond duty requirements. She read the letter twice. Then she set it on her desk and looked at it from a slight distance, the way you looked at something you needed to assess from outside your immediate reaction. The medal was real, and the citation was real, and she was not going to pretend otherwise or perform a modesty she didn't entirely feel. She had done the work. She had earned the recognition. There was nothing wrong with accepting something earned, but she also thought about the 4 people she'd worked on the night of the accident, and about the fact that what she'd done for them was exactly what she would have done in any other circumstances. That the quality of her medical care had nothing to do with the recognition that followed it, and everything to do with 8 years of training and the understanding that when a person needed care, the person needed care. Full stop. The recognition was for the night. The work was for every night. She put the letter in her desk drawer and went back to what she'd been doing before it arrived. Major Hargrove requested a one-on-one meeting the following week. They met in Hargrove's office at the end of the duty day, when the building had cleared out enough that the conversation didn't require careful volume management. Hargrove had 2 cups of coffee that she'd made herself, which was a signal. She only made coffee when she intended to stay in a conversation for a while. "There's an assignment," Hargrove said. "Tell me." It's being built as a direct response to the case. The Army's Medical Command is establishing a formal review protocol for situations where military personnel are involved in civilian law enforcement encounters. The protocol needs to be written, implemented, and staffed. They're looking for someone to lead the initial working group. She paused. You'd be detached from the 44th for 6 months, Washington-based, with travel. Nora looked at her. They want the person who the protocol is about to write the protocol. They want the person who understands why it needs to exist to build it so that it actually works rather than just existing on paper. Hargrove held her coffee cup with both hands. There's a difference. And yes, I think they want someone who isn't going to accept a version that's technically compliant but functionally toothless. Would I have the authority to reject drafts that are technically compliant but functionally toothless? You'd have the authority to escalate them with formal documentation of why they're insufficient. A pause. Which in the right hands is the same thing. Nora was quiet for a moment. She thought about the protocol, about what it would need to contain to be worth the paper it was on. Not just procedures for the aftermath of incidents like hers, but training requirements, escalation chains, documentation standards that created accountability before something went wrong rather than after. She thought about Marcus Teller and Corporal Holt and Yara Osei and the 25 people she'd never meet who had filed complaints that went nowhere, and about the shape of a system that might, if built correctly, mean that the next person on that highway had somewhere to call before the situation required a colonel with a satellite phone. I'll do it, she said. I know, Hargrove said. I told them you'd say yes before I asked you. You could have just told me directly. I could have. Hargrove almost smiled. But you needed to decide. The sentencing hearings ran across 6 weeks in the fall. Nora attended 2 of them, not as a speaker, not as a participant in the formal proceedings, but as a person in the room. She sat in the gallery with her hands in her lap and watched the machinery of accountability do what it was designed to do when it was functioning correctly, which it was not always and was now. Derek Solano was sentenced to 38 months in federal prison, reduced to 26 on the cooperation agreement terms. He stood at the defendant's table and listened to the sentence without visible reaction, which was either composure or emptiness or both. His attorney had gotten him the best outcome available given the evidence, which was not a good outcome by any ordinary measure. He would serve time. He would lose his certification permanently. He would carry the federal conviction into every subsequent context. When the sentence was read, Nora sat in the gallery and felt nothing dramatic. That was the truth of it. Not catharsis, not the particular release she might have expected from standing on a desert highway with her hands on a car roof and ending, eventually, here. What she felt was something quieter and more durable, the recognition that something had happened that should not have happened, and that the consequence was real and proportionate and documented. And that documentation was the closest thing to permanence that institutions could offer. Rhea Strand was sentenced 6 weeks later, 44 months, no cooperation reduction because she had not cooperated. She had fought every stage of the process with the particular determination of someone who had spent years believing that the institutional protection she'd extended to Solano would extend to her, and had discovered too late that protection was a finite resource, and she had spent it on someone whose problems were ultimately larger than her capacity to contain them. When the verdict came, she sat very still and stared at a point somewhere above the judge's head. Nora was not there for Strand's sentencing. She was in Washington, in a conference room with 7 other people, reviewing the 3rd draft of the protocol she was writing. The draft was better than the 2nd, but still had 2 sections that were functionally insufficient, and she had marked them with the specific kind of annotation that made clear she would not be accepting this version without revision. The person across the table from her, a senior Army lawyer named Garfield, who had been doing this for 22 years, looked at her annotations and said, "You know you're going to make enemies doing it this way." "I know," she said. "That doesn't concern you?" She looked at him. "The enemies I make by insisting that a protection protocol actually protects people are the right kind of enemies to have. If that's the standard for concern, I'm not concerned." Garfield looked at her annotations for another moment. Then he made a note of his own, next to her first flag, that said, "Revise." Agreed insufficient. He moved to the second. They worked until 7 p.m. The coffee was bad, and the fluorescent lights were the particular shade of institutional white that existed nowhere in nature. And there were 11 more drafts between that version and the final one, and Nora pushed on every draft the same way she'd pushed on every stage of everything she'd been part of since mile 62. Not with drama, not with performance, but with the steady application of the understanding that insufficient was insufficient, regardless of how much effort had gone into producing it. The protocol was finalized 4 months later. It was 31 pages. It included mandatory training requirements, a federal escalation pathway, documentation standards, and a review process that could not be closed at the supervisory level without escalation to a command authority. It included a specific provision, written by Nora and surviving every revision without significant change, that required any seizure of military credentials or equipment during a civilian law enforcement encounter to trigger an automatic notification to the service member's commanding officer within 2 hours. 2 hours. Not 6, not 24, not never. 2 hours. Because 2 hours was what the difference looked like between a person in a holding room with no phone and a colonel on a satellite phone with the right numbers. She didn't know how many people the provision would help. She didn't know how many future miles 62 it would interrupt before they became what hers had become. She knew it was real, and it was in the record, and it had teeth because she'd insisted on teeth, and that was the work done as well as it could be done in the time she'd had to do it. The Army Commendation Medal was presented at Fort Mercer on a Thursday morning in November at a ceremony that was neither large nor small. Maybe 40 people, the kind of gathering that meant something to everyone in it without needing to mean something to anyone outside it. Colonel Carver was there. He'd driven 3 hours from his current posting, which Nora had not asked him to do, and which he had apparently decided to do because he was the kind of officer who understood that the ceremonies worth attending were the ones you attended because they mattered, not because they were required. Okafor was there. Hargrove stood at the front and read the citation with the precise, formal attention of someone who had written most of it and believed every word. Corporal Darius Holt was there, fully cleared for duty, standing straight in his uniform, with the careful posture of someone who was aware of what the inside of a cleared left lung felt like, and did not intend to take it for granted. Yara Osei was there, sent by her unit with a note from her CO that Nora read quickly before the ceremony, and set aside because it said things she didn't know how to absorb in a 30-second window. Marcus Teller was there. He had driven 2 hours from where he lived, which was the thing that was hardest to look at directly. He was 54, with the build of someone who had done physical work for most of his life, and the expression of someone who had learned through specific and prolonged experience that showing up was an act of will rather than a reflex. He wore a button-down shirt and sat in the third row and held his hands in his lap the way Nora held hers when she was absorbing something she wasn't yet ready to name. After the ceremony, after the medal was pinned and the citation read and the photographs taken, and the brief formal reception had run its natural course, Nora found him standing near the edge of the room with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. She stood next to him and didn't say anything for a moment. "You didn't have to come," she said finally. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." "How's the device?" "Working," he said. "Like it should have been for the past 14 months. She nodded. They stood with that for a moment. "That provision you wrote," he said. "The 2-hour one. I read about it in the federal record." "It's in the protocol, yes." "Would it have helped me? If it had existed?" She thought about this carefully, because he deserved careful. "I don't know if it would have returned your device faster, but it would have meant that 14 months of your complaint sitting in a resolved file would have had a different shape. Someone with authority would have known within 2 hours that your equipment was taken. The official record would have reflected that knowledge." She paused. "Whether that would have changed what happened to you specifically, I can't say. But it would have changed what the system knew. And what the system knows matters, even when the system is slow to use what it knows." He looked at his coffee. "That's an honest answer. I'm not going to tell you the protocol fixes everything. It doesn't fix what already happened. It's not designed to. What's it designed to do? Make it harder," she said, "for the next person. Make it harder for someone to decide that a person doesn't have anyone to call and then arrange for that to be true." He was quiet. Then he looked at her, really looked at her, the way people looked at each other when they were trying to determine if the conversation was real, and said, "I filed 3 complaints. In the first year before I gave up, I filed them because I thought that was what you were supposed to do when something wrong happened. It is what you're supposed to do. But nothing happened." "I know. So what you're saying is that the protocol is the part that makes the filing mean something." "That's exactly what I'm saying." He nodded slowly. Something in his face that had been held tight since she'd walked over to him released slightly. Not all the way, not the permanent release of something fully resolved, because permanent resolution wasn't what this situation produced. But the particular tension of a man who had stopped believing that any of this was connected to any of that, who had filed and watched the machinery not move and concluded that he was invisible to it. That tension was different now. It had a different shape. "Okay," he said. "Okay." She raised her cup slightly. He raised his. It was a quiet gesture between two people who had been on the same highway 14 months apart and had arrived, by different paths and at different costs, at the same Thursday morning in November. She drove home that evening through the high desert, alone, the way she'd been driving this road for 4 years. The mile markers passed in the dark. The asphalt was the same, the scrub brush was the same, the sky was the same extraordinary dark that happened when you were far enough from the lights to see what was actually above you. She passed mile 62 without marking it. She noticed that she'd passed it a moment after, registered it the way you registered something you'd decided not to make a ceremony of. It was a mile marker. It was a piece of numbered asphalt on a stretch of public highway in high desert country. What it meant was entirely in the record, documented, sourced, irrefutable, and not in the road itself. She thought about all of it, and then she thought about what she'd learned from all of it, which was not a lesson so much as a clarification of something she'd already known in a different form. That the people who decided, in the first 30 seconds, that someone didn't count, were always operating on a model that was eventually going to fail. Not because the world was arranged to punish them for it, it often wasn't, but because the model was wrong. The model said that authority was visible and credentialed, and came in a form the model already recognized. The model said that certain people, in certain uniforms, on certain roads, didn't have the institutional weight to fight back. The model said that the absence of prior resistance meant there was no resistance available. The model was wrong. It was wrong because authority was not always visible, and because the people who decided not to make noise about what had been done to them were not people who lacked the capacity to make noise. They were people who had made a calculation, and the calculation could change, and the calculation had changed for 51 people when someone called them and told them the process was real and the investigation was real and their complaints were part of something that mattered. The calculation changed when someone picked up the phone. She drove through the dark with the stars overhead and the road ahead and the protocol in a federal archive and a medal in her bag, and the understanding that she had not been made by what happened to her on this road. She had been recognized by it. There was a difference. She had been what she was before mile 62. The miles after it had just made it impossible to pretend otherwise. The high desert was cold at this hour, and the heater in her vehicle ran a little loud, and she had a debrief at 0700 and a draft review at 0900 and a call with Okafor at noon. The work continued, the way work continued. Not triumphantly, not in resolution, but forward, always forward. She kept her hands steady on the wheel and her eyes on the road and drove toward the lights of Fort Mercer, appearing on the horizon like something solid in all that dark, and she did not look back.